The Earth keeps secrets. For thousands of years, it has swallowed cities whole, pulled temples, tombs, and entire civilizations beneath its surface, silent and patient, waiting. And when archaeologists finally break through, when the first light in millennia floods those buried chambers, sometimes what they find doesn't fit, doesn't match, doesn't make sense by any explanation we currently have. Tools that predate the cultures that supposedly used them. Symbols repeated across continents that never contacted each other. For the next 3 hours, we're going deep, in the arid highlands of northern China, where the two-way river carves slowly through cracked yellow earth. There's a place that shouldn't exist. Not because it's impossible to find, but because everything about it challenges what we thought we knew about the ancient world. The site is called Shimao, and for most of modern history it was hiding in plain sight. For decades, archaeologists passing through Shanxi province assumed the massive stone ridgelines rising from the plateau were natural formations, geological accidents shaped by wind and time. Local people had lived in their shadow for generations, unaware of what lay beneath the surface of the earth beneath their feet. Then, in 2011, researchers took a closer look. What they found stopped them cold. Those weren't natural ridgelines, they were walls. Enormous, carefully constructed stone walls, some stretching nearly 6 kilometers in total circumference, some standing originally as high as 70 feet. Built not from mud brick, as was common in early Chinese settlements, but from cut stone, assembled with a sophistication that had no obvious precedent in the region. Beneath the plateau's highest point sat a pyramid-like stepped structure, a ceremonial platform rising in tiers, commanding a panoramic view of the surrounding landscape. It was, archaeologists would later confirm, one of the largest prehistoric structures ever discovered in East Asia, and it was built around 2300 BC. Let that settle for a moment. At the same time, the Great Pyramids of Giza were being completed in Egypt. At the same time, the first cities of Mesopotamia were organizing themselves into early states. An unknown civilization in northern China was constructing a walled megalopolis covering nearly 4 square kilometers. A city whose existence had been entirely absent from the historical record. As excavations deepened, the discoveries grew stranger. Jade artifacts, thousands of them, were unearthed within the site. Eyes carved from jade were found embedded in the walls themselves, as if the city had been built to see. Or perhaps to be seen by something. Archaeologists noted parallels between Shimao's jade work and styles found in cultures hundreds of miles away, suggesting either widespread trade networks or cultural connections that current historical models struggled to explain. Then came the skulls. Buried beneath the eastern gate, carefully, deliberately, were the decapitated heads of young women. Dozens of them. Arranged in pits during what researchers believe were foundation rituals, performed when Shimao's great walls were first being raised. Violence in service of architecture, death as a form of protection. But protection from what? The mainstream interpretation frames Shimao as an early proto-state, a powerful regional center that emerged during a period of increasing social complexity in prehistoric China. Its scale, they argue, reflects growing inequality, centralized authority, and organized labor. A powerful chieftain, perhaps. A ruling class that commanded thousands. That explanation is reasonable, grounded, supported by the evidence we have. But it leaves questions open. Who were these people exactly? They left no written records we have yet deciphered. Their origins remain unclear. And perhaps most puzzling, Shimao didn't grow slowly over centuries the way most ancient cities do. It appears to have been planned. Deliberately conceived at a scale that suggests its builders already knew what they were building before the first stone was laid. How does a prehistoric society, one with no known predecessor culture of comparable scale, simply arrive at that level of architectural ambition? Some researchers point to possible connections with other contemporaneous cultures across the Eurasian steppe. Trade routes, migrations, ideas carried by people moving across vast distances in ways our historical maps haven't fully captured yet. Others sit with the silence and wonder if Shimao represents something we don't yet have a category for. A civilization that rose, flourished, and vanished, leaving behind walls thick enough to outlast memory itself. And somewhere beneath that plateau, beneath layers of earth that archaeologists have only begun to explore, Shimao is still giving up its secrets, slowly, on its own terms. What else is buried there, waiting for the right question to finally bring it into the light? Shimao was hidden beneath open sky, buried in plain sight beneath a landscape that revealed itself only when someone finally thought to ask the right questions. But some cities don't wait to be found. Some cities actively resist it. Deep in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta mountain range of northern Colombia, where the jungle grows so dense it swallows sound itself, there is a city that spent centuries refusing to be discovered. A city so remote, so deliberately concealed by both nature and time, that even the people who eventually stumbled upon it weren't entirely sure what they were looking at. They called it Ciudad Perdida, the lost city, and the name, for once, felt entirely earned. The Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta is one of the most extraordinary geographic formations on Earth. Rising sharply from Colombia's Caribbean coastline, it climbs to nearly 19,000 feet within a horizontal distance of just 26 miles, making it one of the steepest gradients anywhere on the planet. The mountains create their own weather systems, their own microclimates. Valleys so isolated they functioned for centuries as entire worlds unto themselves. It is exactly the kind of place a civilization might choose if it wanted to exist on its own terms. And that is precisely what happened here. Sometime around 800 AD, possibly earlier, some researchers now suggest, a civilization known as the Tairona began construction on a settlement so ambitious in scale that it defies easy categorization. They carved terraces directly into the steep mountain slopes, hundreds of them, stacked and interlocking, creating a series of circular stone platforms that rose through the jungle canopy like a staircase built for something grander than ordinary life. At its peak, Ciudad Perdida may have been home to between 2,000 and 8,000 people, connected by an intricate network of stone-paved paths that wound through the mountains, linking outlying settlements to a central hub of ceremonial and civic life. It predates Machu Picchu by roughly 600 years, and almost no one outside the indigenous communities of the region knew it existed. The Spanish arrived in this part of South America in the 16th century, and what followed was, by any measure, catastrophic for the Tairona. Disease, forced labor, violent conquest. Within decades, a civilization that had flourished for centuries was fractured beyond recovery. The survivors retreated deeper into the mountains, and Ciudad Perdida, without hands to maintain it, without feet to walk its paths, was slowly, quietly consumed by the jungle. The trees moved in first, then the vines, then the moss. Within a few generations, it was as if the city had never existed at all. It would remain that way for nearly 400 years. The rediscovery, when it finally came, arrived not through academic research or government expedition, but through looters. In the early 1970s, a group of treasure hunters working the Colombian jungle began surfacing with extraordinary gold figurines and ceramic vessels unlike anything seen on the regional black market. Archaeologists and authorities took notice. Following the trail of artifacts backward, a process as painstaking as it was dangerous, they were eventually led up into the Sierra Nevada, What they found in 1972 was staggering. Beneath decades of vegetation, the terraces had survived almost entirely intact. The stone pathways were still there. The circular platforms, some stretching 30 meters in diameter, still held their shape. It was, in the words of one Colombian archaeologist, like watching a city exhale after holding its breath for 4 centuries. But as excavations began in earnest, familiar questions started to surface. The Tairona were sophisticated builders, that much was clear. Their stonework showed a precise understanding of the mountain terrain, of drainage, of how to construct permanent infrastructure in one of the wettest, most erosion-prone environments imaginable. Their terracing techniques were elegant, their urban planning deliberate. What remains less clear is the full extent of what they knew, and where that knowledge came from. The Tairona left no written records. Their history exists almost entirely in the oral traditions of their living descendants, the Kogi, Arhuaco, and Wiwa peoples, who still inhabit the higher reaches of the Sierra Nevada today. These communities regard Ciudad Perdida, which they call Teyuna, the heart of the world, not as a ruin, but as a living spiritual site. A place that continues to function, in their understanding, as a center of cosmic balance. They have actively resisted full archaeological excavation of the site, and their reasons, when articulated, carry a weight that is difficult to dismiss. The Kogi, in particular, speak of Teyuna as one node in a vast sacred geography, a network of sites, paths, and natural features across the Sierra Nevada that together form what they describe as a living system, a kind of spiritual infrastructure maintaining the equilibrium of the natural world. They speak of their ancestors not merely as builders, but as keepers of something essential. Mainstream archaeology acknowledges the ceremonial significance of the site, while remaining appropriately cautious about broader metaphysical claims. But fringe researchers have pointed to certain features of Ciudad Perdida that they argue warrant deeper investigation. The precision of its astronomical alignments, the way certain terraces appear, oriented not toward practical concerns, sunlight, water access, defense, but toward specific points on the horizon at specific times of year. The recurring symbolic geometries embedded in its layout, which some argue reflect a cosmological map rather than a civic one. Are these genuine anomalies, or are they the natural byproduct of a culture deeply attuned to the cycles of the natural world? The jungle offers no easy answers. And perhaps that is the most honest thing about Ciudad Perdida. It does not yield its meaning quickly. It does not reward impatience. Even today, after decades of study, after thousands of visitors have made the 4-day trek through the jungle to stand on its ancient terraces, the city retains something fundamentally private, something it has not yet chosen to share. The Kogi elders say that Teyuna is still speaking, that those who know how to listen can hear it even now, working quietly beneath the surface of things, doing what it was always built to do. Whether that is spiritual truth, cultural memory, or something else entirely, something we don't yet have the language to describe, remains, like the city itself, an open question. The Kogi elders speak of cities that listen, of places built not merely for shelter or ceremony, but for something older, a conversation between human beings and the sky above them. It is an idea that sounds at first like poetry, until you stand in the Armenian highlands and realize that someone, thousands of years ago, was doing exactly that. The site is called Zorats Karer, known also as Karahungi, a name that translates roughly as speaking stones. It sits at an elevation of nearly 1,770 meters on a basalt plateau in southern Armenia, surrounded by the kind of landscape that makes time feel unreliable. Rolling hills, open sky in every direction, the silence of a place that has been waiting patiently for a very long time. And rising from that silence, more than 200 ancient standing stones, arranged across an area of roughly 7 hectares, many of them weighing several tons, some still upright after millennia of wind and frost and earthquake. But what makes Zorats Karer different from other megalithic sites is not its scale, it is the holes. Drilled through the upper sections of dozens of these stones, carefully, deliberately, at specific angles, are circular apertures, each roughly 5 centimeters in diameter. They are too precise to be accidental, too consistent to be decorative. And when researchers began measuring the angles at which these holes were oriented, what they found was difficult to explain away. Many of them align with specific points on the horizon, with the rising and setting positions of the sun at the solstices, with particular stars as they would have appeared in the ancient sky thousands of years ago. Someone had turned these stones into instruments. The mainstream archaeological consensus dates Zorats Karer to somewhere between 2000 and 3500 BC, placing it firmly in the Bronze Age. Researchers generally agree the site served multiple purposes. As a cemetery, given the burial cists found nearby, and likely as a ceremonial gathering place. The astronomical alignments, most academics acknowledge, appear intentional, suggesting the people who built this site had developed a sophisticated understanding of celestial movement. That much is agreed upon. What is not agreed upon is how sophisticated that understanding truly was. In the 1980s and 1990s, Armenian astrophysicist Paris Haruni conducted an extensive study of the site and arrived at a conclusion that shook the academic world, or at least the corners of it paying attention. Based on his calculations of stellar positions as they would have appeared in the ancient past, accounting for the slow wobble of Earth's axis known as precession, Haruni argued that Zorats Karer was not merely a Bronze Age ceremonial site. He proposed it was a functional astronomical observatory, and not a recent one. His calculations suggested the stones were aligned to star positions dating to approximately 5,500 BC, pushing the site's origins back not hundreds, but thousands of years beyond conventional estimates. If correct, that would make Zorats Karer one of the oldest astronomical observatories ever identified on Earth. Older than Stonehenge, older than the pyramids, older than almost every structure we currently recognize as evidence of complex human organization. The academic response was measured, skeptical in many quarters. Some researchers pointed to methodological concerns in Haruni's calculations. Others argued that the alignments, while real, could be coincidental or the result of later modifications to the site. The debate has never been fully resolved, but neither has it been fully dismissed. What lingers, for anyone who studies Zorats Karer carefully, is a cluster of details that resist tidy explanation. The holes themselves, for instance. Drilling precise, angled apertures through basalt, one of the hardest stones in the natural world, is not a casual undertaking. It requires planning. It requires tools capable of sustained, controlled force. It requires someone who knew, before the drilling began, exactly what angle was needed and why. This was not the work of people experimenting idly with stone. This was intentional, technical, and purposeful. Then there is the question of cultural memory. Armenia sits at one of the great crossroads of human civilization, a highland corridor between the Black Sea and the Caspian, between Anatolia and the Iranian plateau, through which peoples and ideas have moved for tens of thousands of years. Some researchers have suggested that Zorats Karer may represent evidence of an astronomical tradition far older than the Bronze Age cultures we typically associate with this region. A tradition passed down through generations, encoded in stone because stone, unlike memory, does not fade. Fringe theorists have gone further, connecting the site to speculative narratives about lost proto-civilizations, advanced cultures that supposedly flourished before the great disruptions of the prehistoric world and left traces like Zorats Karer scattered across the globe like breadcrumbs. These theories remain on the outer edge of serious inquiry. They are not supported by current evidence. And yet the questions they are responding to, where did this knowledge come from, who held it, and how far back does it go, are not fringe questions at all. They are the questions any careful observer of this site is eventually forced to ask. Because standing among these stones, looking through one of those drilled apertures at a sky that has barely changed in 10,000 years, something becomes very clear. Whoever built Zorats Karer was not looking up at the stars with wonder alone. They were reading them, tracking them, recording their movements with a precision that implies not casual observation, but generations, perhaps centuries, of accumulated knowledge. Knowledge that was important enough to carve into basalt, important enough to leave behind. What were they trying to preserve? What did the sky tell them that they felt so urgently needed to be written in stone? The plateau holds its answer close, and the wind moves through the holes in the standing stones, as it has always moved, making a sound that is almost, but not quite, like language. There are places in the world where the land itself seems to remember, where the ground holds the shape of what once stood upon it so completely that walking across it feels less like archaeology and more like reading, like turning the pages of something ancient and precise, written not in ink, but in stone and silence and the slow memory of vanished water. Dholavira is one of those places. It sits on Kadir Island, an elevated plateau rising from the white salt flats of the Rann of Kutch in the Gujarat region of northwestern India. For most of the year, the surrounding landscape is one of the most inhospitable on Earth, blinding white, flat to the horizon in every direction. A place where the heat is not merely felt but experienced, where water is not a convenience but a question of survival. And yet, here, in this merciless geography, one of the most sophisticated urban civilizations the ancient world ever produced chose to build its home. The site was first excavated in earnest in 1990. What emerged from the earth over the following decades rewrote significant portions of what we understood about the Indus Valley civilization, a culture that flourished across what is now Pakistan and northwestern India between approximately 3000 and 1500 BC, and which remains, in many essential ways, one of history's great unsolved puzzles. Dholavira was not the largest Indus city. That distinction belongs to Mohenjo-daro and Harappa. But many researchers who have studied it closely argue that it is, in certain respects, the most remarkable. Because Dholavira was built by people who had solved a problem that would have defeated almost anyone else. There is almost no natural water here. The two seasonal streams that flank Kadir Island, the Mansar and the Manhar, run for only a portion of the year. For the rest, they are dry. The rainfall is sparse and unpredictable. The groundwater is saline. By any conventional measure, this is not a place where a city of tens of thousands should have been able to exist for 1,500 years. And yet it did. What the builders of Dholavira created to make that possible is, even by modern standards, breathtaking in its ambition. A water management system of extraordinary complexity, a network of rock-cut reservoirs, channels, dams, and catchment structures carved directly into the bedrock of the plateau, capable of capturing, storing, and distributing every drop of rainwater that fell on the site and its surroundings. 16 reservoirs have been identified so far. Some researchers believe there may be more. Together, they gave the city the capacity to store millions of liters of water, enough to sustain its population through the long, brutal dry seasons that define this part of the world. This was not improvised. It was not gradual. The system appears, from the archaeological evidence, to have been designed, conceived as a whole, then executed with a precision that implies advanced engineering knowledge of hydrology, of gradient, of how water moves through stone under pressure. Where that knowledge came from remains an open question. The broader mystery of Dholavira is, in many ways, the mystery of the Indus Valley civilization itself. A culture that appears in the archaeological record already fully formed, already urban, already possessed of standardized weights and measures, sophisticated sewage systems, and a level of civic planning that would not be matched in Europe for another 2,000 years. And then, around 1900 BC, it began to decline. The reasons are debated. Climate shift is the leading explanation. Evidence suggests the monsoon patterns that fed the region's rivers began to change, drying out the waterways that sustained Indus cities across a vast geographic area. Dholavira's ingenious water system, remarkable as it was, could not compensate indefinitely for the failure of the rains. But there are details in the archaeological record that complicate the clean narrative of environmental collapse. The Indus script, for instance, a writing system found inscribed on seals, tablets, and artifacts across dozens of Indus sites, has never been deciphered. Despite over a century of attempts by linguists, cryptographers, and computational analysts, the script remains unreadable. We do not know what language it represents. We do not know what it says. At Dholavira, a large signboard was discovered near the northern gate of the city. 10 large Indus script symbols, carved from white gypsum and set against a dark background, displayed in a prominent public location. It is the largest Indus inscription ever found, and we cannot read a single word of it. What was it announcing? A law, a name, a warning, a dedication to something sacred. The sign was placed where it would have been seen by everyone entering the city, which suggests its message was considered important enough to make public, permanent, and large. That message has been waiting in silence for 4,000 years. Some fringe researchers have proposed connections between the Indus script and other undeciphered ancient writing systems. The Minoan Linear A script of the Aegean, for instance, or early Tamil inscriptions from southern India. These connections remain speculative and are not supported by mainstream linguistics. But the question beneath the speculation is legitimate and urgent. Who were these people, in the fullest sense? What did they believe? How did they govern themselves? What stories did they tell about their own origins? We have their cities, we have their artifacts, we have their measurements and their drainage systems and their carefully graded streets. We do not have their words, and without their words, Dholavira remains a city we can walk through, but cannot truly enter. A civilization we can map, but cannot yet fully understand. Somewhere beneath those white salt flats, beneath the weight of 4,000 years of silence, the answer to that inscription is still waiting, patient as stone, certain somehow that eventually someone will learn to ask it in the right language. Dholavira taught us that ancient people could engineer survival in places that should have broken them. That necessity, applied to a brilliant enough mind, produces solutions that outlast the civilization that created them. But there is another kind of ingenuity. Not the kind that manages a hostile landscape, but the kind that becomes it. In the Xinjiang region of far northwestern China, where the Taklamakan Desert stretches toward the horizon like a warning, there's a city that was not built upon the earth. It was carved out of it. Jiaohe sits on a narrow plateau rising from the confluence of two river valleys, a natural island of yellow loess soil, its cliffs dropping sharply on all sides, the rivers below serving as a moat that nature provided without being asked. The plateau is roughly 30 meters high at its edges. Its shape, from above, resembles a willow leaf. Long, narrow, elevated. Defensible in a way that required almost no additional fortification. Whoever chose this location was not merely thinking about shelter. They were thinking about survival in a landscape where the wrong decision meant death, and the right decision meant centuries. The city itself is extraordinary in a way that photographs struggle to convey. There are no constructed walls at Jiaohe, no stone blocks hauled from distant quarries, no fired brick. Instead, the builders excavated downward, cutting streets, rooms, corridors, and temples directly into the living plateau, leaving the walls standing as they removed the earth between them. The structures that remain are not buildings in the conventional sense. They are the spaces left behind after subtraction. Architecture as negative space, a city shaped not by what was added, but by what was taken away. The result is unlike anywhere else on Earth. Walking through Jiaohe, or what survives of it, is to move through a landscape that feels simultaneously ancient and immediate. The walls, worn smooth by centuries of wind-driven sand, glow amber in the afternoon light. The streets are still there, still recognizable, still leading somewhere. The remains of a large Buddhist monastery occupy the northern end of the plateau, its central tower still standing, still reaching upward with a kind of stubborn dignity. The city was inhabited for an extraordinarily long span of time. Evidence suggests occupation beginning as early as the 2nd century BC, with the site growing in significance as it became a key node on the Silk Road, that vast network of trade routes connecting China to Central Asia, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. At its peak, during the Tang Dynasty, Jiaohe may have housed several thousand people. Merchants, monks, soldiers, administrators. A cosmopolitan community at the edge of the known world. Then, sometime in the 14th century, the city was abandoned. The conventional explanation points to Mongol incursions. The military campaigns that reshaped Central Asia during the 13th and 14th centuries disrupted trade routes, depopulated cities, and unraveled the administrative structures that kept Silk Road settlements functioning. Jiaohe, exposed and isolated on its plateau, may simply have become untenable. Its population dispersed, its purpose dissolved, and the desert, patient as always, moved in. But the archaeology of Jiaohe contains details that complicate the straightforward narrative of military disruption and abandonment. The site shows evidence of multiple distinct occupation periods, each leaving its own material signature. Different burial practices, different architectural styles, different artifact assemblages. The people who lived here across 1,500 years were not a single, continuous community. They were layered, successive, each group inheriting a city shaped by those who came before, adapting it, modifying it, making it their own without erasing what was already there. This layering raises questions that excavation alone cannot fully answer. Who were the earliest inhabitants of the plateau? The historical record for the region before the Han Dynasty is fragmentary at best. Chinese sources refer to a kingdom called Anterior Jushi occupying this area, but the details are sparse and filtered through the perspective of a rival power writing about a people it eventually absorbed. The Jushi left no written records of their own that have survived. What survives instead are their dead. Burial sites in and around Jiaohe have yielded human remains of striking physical diversity. Evidence, researchers argue, of the extraordinary ethnic and cultural mixing that characterized the Tarim Basin region throughout antiquity. Some of the oldest mummies found in the broader Xinjiang region, dating back several thousand years, display physical characteristics suggesting origins far to the west, raising questions about prehistoric migration patterns across Central Asia that remain actively debated among geneticists, archaeologists, and historians. Jiaohe sits at the center of that debate geographically, if not always directly. Fringe researchers have used the broader mystery of the Tarim Basin's ancient population to propose narratives of lost migrations, of peoples carrying advanced knowledge across continents in prehistory, settling in places like Jiaohe as waypoints in journeys our current maps cannot trace. Mainstream scholarship is more measured, acknowledging the genuine complexity of Central Asian prehistory while resisting the leap to lost civilizations. But the underlying question, who was here first and where did they come from, is one that serious researchers are actively working to answer, using DNA analysis, isotope studies, and the patient, painstaking work of reading what the Earth gives up slowly. And perhaps that is what Jiaohe ultimately asks of us. Patience. It is a city that survived by becoming part of its landscape, by refusing to announce itself, by letting the plateau absorb and protect it. It did not build walls to keep the world out. It simply became harder than the world around it. And it is still here, still standing at the edge of the desert, still holding whatever it was given to hold. Trade goods long since dissolved to dust, prayers offered in languages no longer spoken, the quiet weight of every life that passed through its carved and narrow streets. What did this city witness across 15 centuries of human movement along the Silk Road? What passed through here? What ideas, what knowledge, what people that left no trace in any archive, no echo in any text? The plateau keeps its own record, written not in words, but in the slow erosion of wind on ancient walls, patient, deliberate, and not yet finished speaking. Jiaohe endured by becoming inseparable from its landscape, by letting the earth itself become the architecture, by making the boundary between city and ground so complete that one could not exist without the other. On the other side of the world, in a different kind of wilderness, a different civilization arrived at a similar instinct, not to build upon the land, but to become unreachable within it. In the cloud forests of northern Peru, where the Andes rise and fold into a landscape so vertical it seems designed to discourage human ambition, there is a fortress so massive, so improbable in its location, that even today, after decades of study, after thousands of visitor hoques, it refuses to feel entirely explained. Its name is Kuélap, and it sits at nearly 3,000 meters above sea level on a narrow ridge above the Utcubamba River Valley, wrapped in mist so consistently that the clouds are not a weather event here. They are a permanent condition, a feature, as much a part of the site as the stone walls themselves. Those walls are what stop you first. Rising in places to nearly 20 meters, roughly 6 stories, they are built from millions of carefully fitted limestone blocks, each one cut and placed without mortar, held together by geometry and weight and the accumulated precision of countless human hands. The outer perimeter stretches for more than 600 meters in length. The total volume of stone used in Kuélap's construction is estimated to be 3 times greater than that used in the Great Pyramid of Giza. 3 times. Let that number settle against the image of this place. A narrow Andean ridge above the clouds, accessible only by trails so steep they function more as vertical climbs than paths. Every stone was carried here. The builders were the Chachapoyas, a culture that flourished in this region from approximately 900 AD until their eventual conquest by the Inca Empire in the late 15th century. The Spanish, arriving shortly after, recorded fragmented accounts of them, describing a people who built in high, remote places, who resisted conquest with extraordinary tenacity, and who were, by some accounts, physically distinct from neighboring Andean cultures in ways that puzzled early colonial observers. The Chachapoyas left no written language. What they left instead was stone. Kuélap was not their only construction. The cloud forests of the Chachapoyas region are scattered with hundreds of circular stone structures, defensive walls, and ceremonial sites, distributed across terrain so difficult that many have still not been fully surveyed. But Kuélap was their greatest achievement, their most deliberate statement, a structure that required generations of sustained, organized labor to complete, and which, even at the moment of its construction, must have seemed to those who built it like something permanent, something that would last. They were not wrong. The interior of the fortress contains the foundations of hundreds of circular stone dwellings, the signature architectural form of the Chachapoyas, distinct from the rectangular structures preferred by the Inca and other Andean cultures. A central platform, likely ceremonial, occupies a prominent position within the complex. A peculiar inverted cone-shaped structure, its purpose still debated, sits near the southern end. Its form unlike anything else at the site, unlike anything else in the broader Andean archaeological record. No one is entirely certain what it was for. Mainstream archaeology generally interprets Kuélap as a defensive stronghold, a fortified settlement built at altitude to protect its inhabitants from the raids and territorial pressures that characterized inter-community conflict in this region during the first millennium AD. The narrowness of its 3 entrance passages, each tapering to allow only single-file entry, supports this reading. The height of its walls, the commanding view of the valley below. Defense, the evidence suggests, was always on the minds of the people who built here. But some researchers have pressed against the purely defensive interpretation, arguing that the scale of Kuélap, the sheer, almost irrational investment of labor it represents, points to a significance beyond the military. Ceremonial centers in the Andean world were frequently built at altitude, the height itself considered sacred, a closer proximity to the sky deities and mountain spirits that animated Andean cosmology. Was Kuélap a fortress? Almost certainly. Was it also something more? The evidence, read carefully, suggests yes, though what exactly that something more might have been remains difficult to define with precision. The Chachapoyas themselves complicate easy understanding. Their origins are poorly documented. Their relationship to neighboring cultures, the earlier Wari Empire, the later Inca, involved both conflict and absorption, a complex history of resistance and assimilation that left the archaeological record layered and difficult to read cleanly. Fringe researchers have seized on certain physical descriptions recorded by early Spanish chroniclers, references to Chachapoyas individuals with lighter complexions and features distinct from other Andean populations, to propose theories of transoceanic contact, of migrations from distant continents leaving traces in the cloud forests of Peru. These theories are not supported by current genetic or archaeological evidence, but the legitimate question of Chachapoyas' origins, where this culture came from, how it developed its distinctive architectural traditions, what relationship it had to the broader tapestry of Andean civilization, remains genuinely open and genuinely interesting to serious researchers. What is not in question is the achievement itself. Standing at the base of Kuélap's outer wall, looking up at 20 meters of precisely fitted limestone rising into cloud, the question of who built this and why becomes almost secondary to the simple, overwhelming fact that it exists at all. That human beings, without metal tools, without wheeled transport, without any of the mechanical advantages we associate with large-scale construction, chose this ridge above everything, and then filled it with stone until it became permanent. Until it became, in some essential way, part of the mountain itself. The Chachapoyas are gone now, absorbed and scattered by conquest, their language lost, their stories untranscribed. But Kuélap remains, still wrapped in its clouds, still watching the valley below with the patient, elevated gaze of something that has already outlasted one civilization's attempt to erase it. What else did the Chachapoyas know about this land, about this sky, about whatever it was they were building toward, that the clouds have not yet seen fit to reveal? Kuélap rose above its world, chose height, chose visibility, chose the defiant permanence of stone against sky. But not every civilization announces itself that way. Some sink quietly into the earth. Some choose the horizontal over the vertical. Some leave their mark not in walls that climb toward clouds, but in layers, pressed into the ground over centuries, one life at a time, until the accumulated weight of human habitation becomes something the earth itself cannot forget. Bhirrana is that kind of place. It sits in the Fatehabad district of Haryana, in the flat, sun-hardened plains of northwestern India, a landscape that offers none of the drama of the Andes or the mystery of a jungle-wrapped plateau. There are no cliffs here, no river gorges, no natural theater to frame what was once here. There is only the land, and beneath it, something extraordinary. Bhirrana was identified as an archaeological site in the 1970s, but it was not until excavations deepened in the early 2000s that researchers began to understand what they were truly dealing with. Beneath the surface of this quiet, unremarkable stretch of Indian plain lay occupation layers of staggering depth, cultural strata descending through time in a sequence so long, so continuous, that when the dating results finally came back from the laboratories, they quietly rewrote one of the oldest arguments in South Asian archaeology. The oldest layers at Bhirrana have been dated to approximately 7,570 BC. That is not a typographical error. Nearly 9,600 years ago, human beings were living at this site in organized, settled communities, cultivating crops, making pottery, establishing the rhythms of sedentary life in a form recognizable as the foundation of what would eventually become urban civilization. This predates the earliest known phases of the Indus Valley civilization by thousands of years. It pushes the roots of South Asian settled life back into a period we typically associate with the very beginnings of agriculture itself, a time when the great river valleys of Mesopotamia were only just beginning to see the first experiments in farming, when the monuments of Egypt were still millennia away from conception. If the dating is correct, and it has been published in peer-reviewed research and has not been definitively refuted, then Bhirrana is among the oldest continuously occupied settlements ever identified anywhere on Earth. The implications of that are worth sitting with. The conventional narrative of civilization's origins tends to focus on a handful of locations: the Fertile Crescent, the Nile Valley, the Yellow River Basin, as the primary cradles from which complex human society emerged and spread. These are legitimate centers of early development, supported by extensive archaeological evidence. But Bhirrana complicates the tidiness of that narrative. It suggests that in the Indian subcontinent, the roots of settled life may extend as deeply, perhaps more deeply, than anywhere else we have yet looked. That the Indus Valley civilization, already remarkable for its sophistication and scale, was not an emergence but a culmination. The visible peak of a developmental process that had been unfolding in this region for thousands of years before the first great cities rose. The material culture recovered from Bhirrana supports this reading in careful, incremental ways. Pottery sequences found at the site show a gradual, continuous evolution across multiple occupation phases, early hand-formed vessels giving way over centuries to wheel-thrown forms, decorative styles shifting and developing in patterns that suggest not replacement by outside cultures but organic internal growth. The people at Bhirrana were not being periodically displaced and replaced. They were developing, learning, passing knowledge forward through generations in an unbroken chain. Animal bones at the site show evidence of domestication processes unfolding in real time across the stratigraphic layers. Wild species gradually shifting toward the controlled breeding patterns that define agriculture. Here, in the physical evidence of ancient meals, is a record of one of the most significant transitions in human history, preserved in the soil of an unassuming field in Haryana. But beneath the careful, evidence-based archaeology, questions accumulate. The broader region around Bhirrana, the now largely dry Ghaggar-Hakra River basin, has long been at the center of a significant and unresolved debate. Some researchers have proposed that this ancient river system, which once flowed through this area before changing climate conditions caused it to diminish and disappear, may be the physical basis for the Saraswati River described in the ancient Vedic texts of India, a sacred river said to have nourished a great civilization before vanishing from the earth. The identification of the Ghaggar-Hakra with the Vedic Saraswati is contested. It sits at the intersection of archaeology, hydrology, and a deeply politicized debate about the origins of South Asian civilization that generates more heat than clarity in many academic quarters. But the underlying geographical reality is not contested. There was once a significant river here. It supported dense human settlement for thousands of years. And then, as the climate shifted and the river diminished, the civilization it had sustained underwent a transformation. Its population dispersing, its cities gradually depopulating, its people moving toward the coasts and the river valleys that still held water. Bhirrana fits into that story as a beginning, perhaps the beginning, a place where the thread starts 9,000 years ago in the hands of people who had no way of knowing what their quiet, settled lives on this flat plain would eventually become. No way of knowing that the crops they planted, the pots they shaped, the fires they kept through the long, dry nights were the first words of a sentence that would take millennia to complete. We have found that beginning. But the story it started, the full arc of what grew from these roots, what was lost when the river disappeared, what knowledge dissolved with it into the dry earth, that story is still being assembled, fragment by fragment, layer by layer, one careful excavation at a time. And somewhere in the unexcavated depths of Bhirrana, in the layers that no shovel has yet reached, the oldest chapters of that story are still waiting, patient as the land itself, certain that eventually someone will come looking deep enough to find them. Bhirrana showed us how civilization begins, quietly, incrementally, in the patient accumulation of small decisions made by people who could not have imagined what those decisions would eventually become. But there is another kind of mystery. Not the mystery of origins, the mystery of endings, of a civilization at the absolute height of its power, sophisticated, literate, militarily dominant, diplomatically connected to every major power of its age, that one day, without obvious warning, without a single surviving explanation, simply stopped. Hattusa was the capital of the Hittite Empire, and its disappearance is one of the most debated, most studied, and most stubbornly unresolved questions in the entire archaeology of the ancient world. The city sits in the high plateau of north-central Anatolia, in what is now Turkey, near the modern village of Boğazkale. The landscape here has a severity to it. Rolling, treeless hills of pale stone, wide skies, winters that arrive early and stay long. It is not an obviously inviting place to build an empire's heart. And yet the Hittites chose it, fortified it, and from its walls proceeded to construct one of the most formidable states the ancient Near East ever produced. At its peak, between approximately 1650 and 1200 BC, the Hittite Empire controlled a territory stretching from the Aegean coast of Anatolia deep into the Levant. They were the dominant military power of their age, the only state in the ancient world capable of fighting Egypt to a standstill. Their famous confrontation with Rameses II at the Battle of Kadesh, fought around 1274 BC, resulted in what is often cited as the earliest surviving peace treaty in recorded history, a copy of which hangs today in the United Nations headquarters in New York. These were not a peripheral people. These were one of the defining civilizations of the Bronze Age world. Hattusa reflected that stature. At its height, the city covered nearly 2 square kilometers, an enormous urban footprint for the ancient world. Its defensive walls stretched for more than 6 kilometers, reinforced by towers, posterns, and a series of monumental gates decorated with extraordinary stone sculptures. The Lion Gate, the Sphinx Gate, the King's Gate, flanked by a warrior relief of such confident artistry that it feels, even now, like a statement of absolute power. Within those walls stood temples, at least 31 identified so far, possibly more, along with palace complexes, administrative buildings, and a vast archive. That archive is, in many ways, the most significant thing Hattusa left behind. Tens of thousands of clay tablets, inscribed in cuneiform across multiple languages, have been recovered from the site. Hittite, Akkadian, Hurrian, Luwian, Palaic, diplomatic correspondence, legal codes, religious rituals, mythological texts, a literature of extraordinary breadth for a culture that much of the world had, until the late 19th century, essentially forgotten existed. The tablets speak, and what they tell us is of a civilization fully aware of its own complexity, its own history, its own place in a web of international relationships that connected Bronze Age courts from Egypt to Mesopotamia to the Aegean. And then, around 1180 BC, the tablets stop. Not gradually. Not with a trailing off of administrative detail that might suggest slow decline. The record simply ends. The city was burned. Its temples and palaces were destroyed. The population disappeared, scattered or killed or absorbed into a world that was, at that precise historical moment, undergoing a transformation of almost incomprehensible scale. Hattusa fell during what historians call the Bronze Age collapse, a period of roughly 50 years at the end of the 13th century BC, during which virtually every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean simultaneously disintegrated. The Mycenaean Greeks, the Ugaritic city-states of the Syrian coast, the Egyptian New Kingdom, though it survived in weakened form. Trade networks that had connected the Mediterranean world for centuries went silent almost overnight. The speed and totality of the collapse remains one of the great unsolved problems of ancient history. The conventional explanations are multiple and layered, which is itself revealing. Drought, supported by paleoclimatological evidence, likely disrupted agricultural systems across the region. A mysterious group referred to in surviving texts as the Sea Peoples, raiders of uncertain origin, who appear in Egyptian records attacking coastlines across the eastern Mediterranean, contributed to the destabilization. Internal rebellions, systems collapse, the fragility of interconnected economies when multiple nodes fail simultaneously. All of these have been proposed, and all likely played some role. But the honest answer is that we do not fully understand why the Bronze Age collapse happened with the speed and totality that it did. And Hattusa sits at the center of that mystery. Because the archaeological evidence at the site contains a detail that continues to trouble researchers. Before the city burned, it appears to have been deliberately emptied. Portable valuables were removed. Cult statues, sacred objects central to Hittite religious practice, were taken from the temples. The destruction, when it came, fell upon a city that had already, in some essential way, been vacated. Did the Hittites see it coming? Did they know what was approaching and choose to abandon their capital rather than defend it? Did they remove their sacred objects because they intended to return, or because they knew they would not? And where did they go? Some researchers have traced possible Hittite successor states into the Levant, small kingdoms in northern Syria that preserved elements of Hittite culture for centuries after the empire's fall. Others have proposed migrations further west into the Aegean, contributing to the population movements that reshaped the post-Bronze Age world. But the core of the Hittite state, its royal family, its priesthood, the keepers of those tens of thousands of tablets, vanished without a clear trail. The gates of Hattusa still stand. The lions still watch the horizon with their worn stone eyes, patient and unreadable, guarding an entrance to a city that its own builders chose to leave. What did they know that made them go? And where, in the end, did the heart of that empire finally come to rest? Hattusa left us with the image of gates still standing, stone lions watching an empty city, guarding the memory of a civilization that chose to vanish rather than be destroyed. But some places were never abandoned. Some places held such profound meaning, such deep, accumulated sacred weight, that civilization after civilization returned to them, built upon them, claimed them, and refused to let them go. Jebel Barkal is one of those places. It rises from the flat desert of northern Sudan with the abruptness of something placed rather than formed. A sandstone mesa climbing nearly 100 meters above the surrounding plain, its sheer faces dropping to the earth in vertical walls of golden rock. At its southern end, separated from the main massif by centuries of erosion, a slender pinnacle of stone rises like a needle against the sky, roughly 75 meters tall, solitary, improbable, casting a shadow that moves across the desert floor with the slow precision of a sundial. The Nile bends here at the fourth cataract, in a wide arc that brings the river close to the base of the mountain before turning north again toward Egypt. For anyone traveling upstream from the delta, moving deeper into Africa, deeper into the unknown, Jebel Barkal would have appeared on the horizon like a landmark placed deliberately. A signal, a threshold. And that, it seems, is precisely how the ancient world understood it. The Egyptians arrived here during the reign of Thutmose III, around 1450 BC, pushing the boundaries of their new kingdom empire deep into the territory they called Nubia. What they found at Jebel Barkal stopped them in a way that military conquest alone rarely did. They believed the mountain was the home of the god Amun. Not a home, not a symbol. The actual dwelling place, the primordial mound from which creation itself had emerged, transplanted by divine will to this remote bend in the Nile. The pinnacle at the southern end of the massif they interpreted as a living uraeus, the rearing cobra symbol of royal and divine power, carved by the hands of the gods themselves into the living rock. This was not metaphor to the ancient Egyptians. It was geography made sacred by divine presence. They built temples here accordingly. Cut directly into the base of the mountain, expanded and elaborated by successive pharaohs across centuries, the temple complex at Jebel Barkal became one of the most significant religious sites in the ancient Nile world. Rameses II added to it. Later, rulers returned to it. The mountain itself was considered so powerfully connected to divine legitimacy that control of Jebel Barkal was understood, in political as much as religious terms, as control of something essential. And then Egypt's influence receded, and the people of Kush stepped forward. The kingdom of Kush, the Nubian civilization that flourished in this region for over 1,000 years, did not merely inherit Jebel Barkal from its Egyptian predecessors. They claimed it as their own. More than that, they used it as the theological foundation for an extraordinary political ambition. The Kushite kings argued that Amun's true home had always been here, at Jebel Barkal, not at Karnak. that Egypt, in its southward expansion, had encountered the gods' original dwelling place and built its own religion around a reflection of what was already present in Nubia. In this reading, it was not the Kushites who were the inheritors of Egyptian religious tradition. It was the Egyptians who had always been drawing from a Nubian source. This argument was not merely theological. In the 8th century BC, the Kushite king Tiya, armed with this ideological claim and a formidable army, marched north and conquered Egypt. The Kushite pharaohs, the rulers of what historians call the 25th dynasty, governed Egypt for roughly a century, presenting themselves not as foreign conquerors but as restorers of authentic Amun worship, returning the sacred current to its proper source. They built their own pyramids, steeper, more slender than the Egyptian forms, clustered in the desert around Jebel Barkal and at nearby sites like Meroe, and created a royal architecture that blended Nubian and Egyptian traditions into something distinctly their own. Those pyramids still stand, dozens of them rising from the Sudanese desert in a landscape that most of the world has never seen, largely unvisited, inadequately studied, holding within their burial chambers a history that remains only partially understood. Mainstream archaeology has established the broad outlines of Kushite civilization with increasing clarity over the past century. But the deeper layers of Jebel Barkal's significance, the reasons why this particular mountain, in this particular bend of the Nile, accumulated such extraordinary sacred weight across so many centuries and so many cultures, remain genuinely open to interpretation. Some researchers have pointed to the mountain's visual properties at specific times of year. The way sunlight strikes the pinnacle at the solstices, the way the mountain's shadow falls across the temple entrances at precise astronomical moments, as evidence of intentional sacred geography. That the site was chosen not arbitrarily but because of specific, observable celestial relationships that made it cosmologically legible to those who knew how to read it. Others have noted that Jebel Barkal sits at almost exactly the same latitude as several other significant ancient sacred sites across the African continent, a coincidence that fringe researchers have incorporated into broader theories about prehistoric astronomical knowledge encoded in the placement of sacred geography. These connections remain speculative. The evidence for intentional continental-scale planning is not there in any form that serious scholarship can currently support. But the question of why Jebel Barkal specifically, why this mountain, among all the mountains of the Nile Valley, held such unbroken sacred significance across 3,000 years of human history, is not a fringe question. It is a real one, and it has not yet received a fully satisfying answer. The pinnacle still stands at the mountain's edge, catching the morning light as it has always caught it, indifferent to the empires that have risen and fallen at its base, indifferent to the gods they assigned to it, indifferent to the questions we continue to bring to its feet. What did the ancient world know about this place that made them return to it again and again across 3 millennia? And what does the mountain itself, patient, vertical, and silent, still hold within its stone? Jebel Barkal endured because it meant something that transcended the civilizations that claimed it, a mountain so saturated with sacred significance that empire after empire returned to it, built upon it, and refused to release it. But not every sacred place survives through continuity. Some survive through destruction. Some places are remembered precisely because of how they ended, because the violence of their ending was so complete, so deliberate, so final, that it burned itself into the landscape in a way that time has not been able to fully erase. In the high desert of Zacatecas in north-central Mexico, where the land rises and folds into a series of dry valleys ringed by mountains the color of rust, there is a site whose very name carries the memory of fire: La Quemada, the burned place. It sits on a prominent rocky hill rising sharply from the valley floor, a natural platform that its builders recognized immediately for what it offered. Elevation, visibility, command of the surrounding terrain in every direction. The kind of position that a militarily minded people, or a spiritually minded people, or, as is so often the case in the ancient world, a people who made no distinction between the two, would have found irresistible. Construction began here sometime around 300 AD. Over the following centuries, the site grew into a complex of considerable ambition. Terraced platforms, colonnaded halls, a pyramid structure, defensive walls of rough stone running along the ridgelines, and an extensive network of raised causeways extending outward from the site into the surrounding landscape like spokes from a wheel. Those causeways are among the most intriguing features of La Quemada. Stretching in some cases for kilometers across the valley floor, connecting the central site to smaller outlying settlements, they represent an investment of labor that implies something beyond simple practicality. Roads of this kind, built to this standard, in terrain this demanding, are statements. They impose order on landscape. They declare, in the most physical terms possible, that the center matters, that everything leads here, and that the people who built here intended to remain. They did not remain. Sometime around 900 AD, La Quemada was abandoned. But the archaeological record of that abandonment is not the quiet kind, the gradual emptying of a site whose population drifted elsewhere as conditions changed. The evidence here speaks of something more concentrated, more intentional. The site was burned, not by invaders, or at least not obviously so. The burning appears, in the assessment of many researchers who have studied the site carefully, to have been carried out by the inhabitants themselves. A deliberate act of termination, a ritual ending performed by the people of La Quemada upon their own city before they departed. Why would a people destroy what they had spent centuries building? The mainstream archaeological interpretation frames La Quemada as a frontier outpost of sorts, a northern extension of Mesoamerican cultural influence into a region that sat at the boundary between the settled agricultural civilizations of central Mexico and the more mobile hunter-gatherer cultures of the arid north. In this reading, the site served as a center of regional control, administrative, military, and ceremonial, for a network of communities spread across the valley below. Its abandonment, researchers suggest, likely resulted from the broader systemic pressures that destabilized much of Mesoamerica during the Epiclassic period, the same forces that contributed to the decline of Teotihuacan and the reshaping of political power across the region. Drought, resource depletion, the fracturing of trade networks, the withdrawal of whatever political authority had sustained the site's regional dominance. The deliberate burning, in this interpretation, may represent a formal ritual closure, a ceremonial act of ending that was understood, within the spiritual framework of the people who performed it, as a necessary completion. Not destruction, but release. A way of returning the site to whatever forces had animated it before moving on. That interpretation is grounded and reasonable, but La Quemada contains details that resist full containment within it. The Hall of Columns, a large, open ceremonial structure near the center of the site, yielded, during excavation, evidence of practices that unsettled researchers. Human bones, processed in ways that indicate deliberate defleshing, found in quantities and arrangements suggesting repeated, organized ritual activity over an extended period. Not battlefield dead. Not simple burial, something more systematic. The nature and meaning of these practices remains debated. Some researchers interpret the evidence as indicating ritual sacrifice on a significant scale, consistent with patterns found at other Mesoamerican sites, where the boundary between warfare, ritual, and cosmological obligation was frequently blurred. Others urge caution. noting that the interpretation of skeletal processing evidence is complex, and that mortuary practices across ancient cultures varied enormously in ways that do not always map cleanly onto modern categories of meaning. What is clear is that something significant happened in that hall over a long period of time that the people of La Quemada considered important enough to perform repeatedly, and then they burned it all. Fringe researchers have connected La Quemada to a broader network of sites across the American Southwest and northern Mexico, proposing it as evidence of cultural and possibly ethnic connections stretching far beyond what conventional archaeology currently maps. Some have suggested it as a waypoint in mythological migration narratives, a place referenced obliquely in the origin stories of later Mesoamerican cultures as a stopping point on a longer journey. These connections are speculative, and the evidence for them is thin. But the migration narrative itself, the idea that the people of La Quemada did not simply disperse but moved deliberately toward somewhere, is not fringe at all. It is the logical implication of a deliberate, organized abandonment. They knew they were leaving. They prepared for it. They burned what they were leaving behind, and they went somewhere. The valley below La Quemada is quiet now. The causeways that once radiated outward from the hill have largely returned to earth, their paths visible in certain lights, at certain angles, as faint lines across the landscape. Lines that point outward in every direction, toward destinations that the burned place itself can no longer name. Where did the people of La Quemada go when they set fire to their own city and walked away? And what were they carrying with them? What knowledge, what obligation, what unfinished story that made the burning necessary before the journey could begin? La Quemada burned itself into memory through an act of deliberate ending, a civilization that chose fire over surrender, that transformed destruction into a kind of departure. There is something in that instinct that echoes across the ancient world. The instinct to choose how a story ends, to refuse the terms that conquest attempts to impose, to burn what cannot be protected rather than allow it to be taken. Half a world away, in the forested mountains of what is now Romania, another people made that same choice. And what they left behind, and what they destroyed before leaving, has puzzled researchers for more than a century. Deep in the Orishti Mountains of Transylvania, at an elevation of nearly 1,200 meters, where the forest grows dense and the trails narrow to single file, and the outside world feels genuinely far away, the ruins of Sarmizegetusa Regia emerge from the trees with a quiet authority that is difficult to prepare for. This was the sacred capital of the Dacians, a people the Romans called fierce beyond ordinary measure, a people whose warriors reportedly went into battle without fear of death, not from ignorance of it, but from a theological conviction that death in service of their cause was not an ending, but a transformation. A people who built, in these remote mountain forests, a ceremonial and political center of extraordinary sophistication that the Roman Empire spent decades trying to reach and longer trying to understand. The site itself is arranged across a series of terraced platforms cut into the mountain slope, a feat of engineering that required the movement of enormous quantities of earth and stone in terrain that offered no easy access and no mechanical advantage beyond human will and organized labor. The terraces descend in careful sequence, each level serving a distinct function within the site's overall design. At the heart of Sarmizegetusa Regia stands its most enigmatic feature, the Great Circular Sanctuary. It consists of a series of concentric arrangements, an outer circle of large upright stone and timber elements, inner arrangements of D-shaped wooden columns, and at the center a large circular platform of andesite stone, whose precise function remains debated. The overall form bears a structural resemblance to Stonehenge that researchers have noted without fully explaining. two sites separated by 2,000 kilometers and several centuries, arriving independently at a remarkably similar architectural language. Or perhaps not so independently. The Dacians were not an isolated culture. They occupied a geographic position at the intersection of multiple cultural currents: Celtic influences from the west, Scythian traditions from the eastern steppes, Greek and later Roman contact from the south. The Dacian sacred architecture at Sarmizegetusa may represent a synthesis of traditions drawn from across a vast cultural landscape, processed through a distinctly Dacian theological vision. But the specifics of that vision remain largely opaque to us. The Dacians left no deciphered written tradition of their own. What we know of their beliefs comes filtered through Greek and Roman sources, observers who were, at best, outsiders interpreting an unfamiliar system, and at worst, conquerors constructing a narrative that served their own political purposes. What those sources agree on is the central importance of a figure known as Zalmoxis. The accounts of Zalmoxis are contradictory and strange in ways that suggest they are circling something real without quite grasping it. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BC, described him variously as a god, a semi-divine teacher, and a former slave of Pythagoras, who returned to his people with mystical knowledge acquired in the Greek world. The Dacians, Herodotus wrote, believed in a form of immortality, that death was not finality but passage, and that the souls of the dead went to dwell with Zalmoxis in a realm beyond ordinary existence. Every few years, according to the account, the Dacians sent a messenger to Zalmoxis, a man chosen by lot, thrown onto the points of spears held upright by his companions, and dispatched to the divine realm with a message. If he died cleanly, the message was considered delivered. If he suffered, it was taken as a sign of the messenger's unworthiness, and another was chosen. Modern scholars treat these accounts with appropriate skepticism. Herodotus was writing from significant cultural distance, and his sources were themselves likely unreliable. The practice he describes may be distorted, exaggerated, or entirely misunderstood. But the underlying theology, a genuine, sophisticated belief in the continuity of existence beyond physical death, appears consistently enough across multiple ancient sources to suggest it was real, and that it shaped Dacian culture in fundamental ways. It may also explain what happened at Sarmizegetusa Regia in 106 AD. That was the year the Roman Emperor Trajan completed his second campaign against the Dacians, reaching the sacred capital after years of warfare that had already cost both sides enormously. What his legions found when they arrived is recorded incompletely, and what they found when they entered the sanctuary is recorded barely at all. Before the Romans reached the site, the Dacians had destroyed it. Not partially, not hastily, with deliberate, systematic thoroughness. The great wooden sanctuary elements were burned. Structures were demolished. The site that had served as the spiritual heart of Dacian civilization for centuries was rendered by its own guardians into ruin. The Dacian king Decebalus, rather than fall into Roman hands, took his own life, and the knowledge held within Sarmizegetusa Regia, the specific content of Dacian ritual, the full theology of Zalmoxis, the astronomical knowledge encoded in the circular sanctuary's geometry, went with him. Archaeologists have spent decades carefully excavating the site, recovering the physical layers of its history with increasing precision. The calendar function of the great circular sanctuary is now widely accepted. Its arrangements correlate with solar and lunar cycles in ways that indicate sophisticated astronomical knowledge embedded deliberately in the architecture. How sophisticated, exactly, remains uncertain. Some researchers have proposed that the Dacian calendar system was among the most precise in the ancient world, capable of tracking celestial cycles with an accuracy that rivaled or exceeded contemporary systems in Egypt and Mesopotamia. Others argue the evidence supports a more modest interpretation. The debate continues in academic journals and conference rooms far from the mountain forest, where the answers, if they exist anywhere, are embedded in stone that yields its meaning slowly and incompletely. Fringe researchers have placed Sarmizegetusa Regia within larger narratives of prehistoric astronomical knowledge, proposing connections between the Dacian sanctuary and megalithic traditions stretching across Europe, suggesting a shared ancient science of sky reading that predates the civilizations we typically credit with its development. These proposals exceed what the current evidence can support, but the questions driving them are not unreasonable. Because standing within the remains of the great circular sanctuary, looking at the careful geometry of its stone arrangements, feeling the precision that is still legible even in ruin, it is difficult not to wonder what this place was capable of. What the priests who served here knew, what the circles were tracking, and what that tracking was for. The forest has grown back around Sarmizegetusa Regia now. The trees press close to the ancient terraces. Moss covers the stones that Dacian hands cut and placed with such evident care. And somewhere in the geometry of those circles, in the angles and intervals and alignments that survive even the Romans' best efforts at erasure, the calendar is still running, still counting something, patient as the mountain, indifferent to empire, waiting for someone who still knows how to read it. Sarmizegetusa Regia kept its secrets through deliberate destruction. A people who understood that some knowledge is better surrendered to fire than handed to a conqueror. But there is another way that knowledge disappears. Not through burning, not through a single decisive act of erasure, through accumulation. Through the layering of so many civilizations, so many conquests, so many reinventions upon a single place, that the original signal becomes buried beneath the noise of everything that came after. The truth is still there. It simply requires extraordinary patience to reach it. In the foothills of the Margala Hills in what is now northern Pakistan, where the Potwar Plateau extends toward the first great ranges of the Himalayas, there is a place that may be the single most layered archaeological site in all of South Asia. Its name is Taxila, and its history is so dense, so improbably rich, that simply listing what happened here feels inadequate, like describing an ocean by naming its waves. The site was inhabited from at least the 6th century BC, though some evidence suggests human presence considerably earlier. What is certain is that by the time the Persian Achaemenid Empire expanded into the region under Darius the Ivor's around 518 BC, Taxila was already significant enough to be worth absorbing. It became a provincial capital within one of the largest empires the ancient world had yet produced. A node in a vast administrative network stretching from the Aegean coast to the edges of the Indian subcontinent. Then came Alexander. In 326 BC, Alexander the Great arrived at Taxila during his eastern campaign, and what he found apparently impressed even a man accustomed to the wonders of the conquered world. The city received him peacefully, its ruler Ambi calculating correctly that cooperation with the Macedonian conqueror was preferable to the alternative. Alexander spent time here. His scholars and historians recorded what they observed, and what they described was a city of learning, of wealth, and of a philosophical tradition sufficiently developed to engage Macedonian intellectuals in serious dialogue. The naked philosophers Alexander encountered here, the gymnosophists, as the Greeks called them, were not curiosities. They were representatives of a living tradition of inquiry that had been developing in this region for centuries, engaging questions of existence, ethics, and the nature of reality, with a rigor that the Greeks, for all their philosophical confidence, recognized as genuine. After Alexander withdrew and his empire fragmented, Taxila passed to the Mauryan Empire under Chandragupta, and then reached perhaps its most intellectually significant period under the Emperor Ashoka in the 3rd century BC. It was during this era, and the centuries immediately following, that Taxila functioned as one of the ancient world's great centers of learning, a place where students traveled from across South Asia and beyond to study medicine, law, military science, astronomy, philosophy, and the Vedic texts under masters whose reputations extended far beyond the subcontinent. The university at Taxila, if that word, anachronistic as it is, can be applied to what functioned here, predates the famous Library of Alexandria. It predates the great academies of Athens in terms of its institutional continuity. Some researchers have argued it represents the earliest example of organized higher education in human history, a claim that is debated but not without foundation. What was taught here? What knowledge was transmitted across the generations of students who walked these streets, sat with these teachers, and then carried what they learned outward into the world? The texts recovered from the region, and those referenced in later Indian and Buddhist literature as originating here, cover an extraordinary range. Grammar, logic, medicine, surgery, in forms sophisticated enough to have influenced later Ayurvedic traditions. Astronomy precise enough to track planetary movements. Political philosophy, in the form of the Arthashastra attributed to Chanakya, a treatise on statecraft so cold-eyed and comprehensive that modern scholars have compared it to Machiavelli, though it predates him by nearly 18 centuries. Chanakya himself is said to have been a teacher at Taxila before becoming the architect of the Mauryan Empire's political strategy. If the tradition is accurate, this one city produced both the intellectual framework for one of South Asia's greatest empires and the man who implemented it. Then the Greco-Bactrian kingdoms arrived. Then the Indo-Scythians. Then the Parthians. Then the Kushans, under whose patronage Buddhist art and architecture at Taxila reached extraordinary heights, the stupas and monasteries of this period representing some of the finest religious architecture of the ancient world. Their artistic style, a hybrid of Hellenistic and Indian traditions so seamlessly blended that it constitutes its own unique visual language. Each wave of cultural influence left its mark. Each conquest added a layer, and each layer, when excavated, reveals a Taxila slightly different from the one before, the same location, the same fundamental geography, but reinvented again and again by people who understood that this place mattered and wanted to claim that mattering for themselves. The archaeological site today encompasses 3 distinct urban areas, each representing a different phase of the city's long history, spread across a landscape of quiet fields and low hills that gives no immediate indication of what lies beneath. Sir John Marshall, who led the first major systematic excavations of Taxila in the early 20th century, spent over 20 years here, and acknowledged at the end of that time that he had barely scratched the surface. The site is vast, the layers are deep, and the resources devoted to its continued excavation have never been commensurate with its significance, which raises a question that is not speculative but simply practical and urgent. What is still down there? Fringe researchers have proposed connections between Taxila and traditions of knowledge that mainstream archaeology has not fully mapped, suggesting the city served as a transmission point for astronomical and mathematical knowledge moving between the Indian, Persian, and Hellenistic worlds in ways that our current understanding of ancient intellectual history undersells. Some have gone further, proposing that certain mathematical and cosmological insights that appear in later Greek thought arrived there through contact with the traditions being taught at Taxila. These proposals exist at the edge of what the evidence currently supports. But the mainstream reality is already remarkable enough to make the fringe unnecessary. Because here is what we know with confidence. For nearly 1,000 years, Taxila was a place where the most important ideas of the ancient world converged, where Persian administrative genius met Indian philosophical depth, met Greek scientific inquiry, met Buddhist ethical vision, and where all of these traditions were taught, debated, synthesized, and sent outward into the world in forms that shaped civilizations we still inhabit today. The monasteries are quiet now. The streets of the ancient city are grass and stone, and the patient work of archaeologists moving carefully through what centuries of earth have compressed into layers thin as pages. Somewhere in those layers, in the unexcavated schools and libraries and lecture halls that still lie beneath the Potwar Plateau, the conversations have not ended. They have simply gone underground, waiting for the excavation that will finally bring them back into the light and remind us how much of what we think we discovered was already known, already taught, already passed from teacher to student in a city we largely forgot to remember. Taxila showed us what happens when the world's great currents of thought converge on a single place, how a city can become, across centuries, a vessel for the accumulated wisdom of civilizations that would otherwise never have touched. But Taxila was a place people traveled to, a destination, a center of deliberate pilgrimage for those who sought knowledge and were willing to make the journey to find it. There is a different kind of important place, a place that does not draw people through its reputation alone, but through something more fundamental, something older. A place positioned so precisely at the intersection of the ancient world's needs, water, trade, safety, abundance, that civilization after civilization could not help but return to it, build upon it, and call it, in their own language, by names that all carried the same essential meaning, the place where life was possible. Qal'at al-Bahrain sits on the northern coast of the island of Bahrain, rising from the flat shoreline of the Arabian Gulf in a formation that is immediately recognizable as something other than natural. A tell, in the archaeological sense, an artificial mound created not by geology, but by the compressed accumulation of human habitation across thousands of years. Layer upon layer of cities, each built upon the ruins of the last, each adding its own contribution to a mound that now rises some 12 meters above the surrounding plain and covers an area of roughly 17 hectares. 12 meters of human history, pressed into the earth like pages of a book that no single reader has ever managed to read in full. The site has been occupied, the evidence suggests, from approximately 2300 BC, though some researchers place the earliest traces of significant activity here even earlier, reaching back toward the 3rd millennium BC in ways that connect this small island in the Gulf to some of the most consequential developments in the ancient world. Because Bahrain, in the ancient world, was not a peripheral place, it was Dilmun. The identification of ancient Dilmun with modern Bahrain is one of the more securely established connections in Near Eastern archaeology, supported by cuneiform texts, geographic descriptions, and the material culture recovered from excavations across the island. And Dilmun, in the literature of ancient Mesopotamia, was not simply a trading partner or a regional power, it was paradise. The Sumerian texts describe Dilmun as a pure, clean, bright place, a land where illness did not exist, where animals did not prey upon one another, where fresh water flowed in abundance from the earth itself. A place set apart from the ordinary world by a kind of primordial sanctity. Some of the most ancient Sumerian mythological texts, including traditions that scholars believe influenced later accounts of sacred gardens and other Near Eastern religious traditions, place the original paradise, the place where the first humans lived in proximity to the divine, at Dilmun. At this island, at this shore, at the place where Qal'at al-Bahrain now rises from the earth in silent, compressed testimony to everything that happened here afterward. The practical basis for Dilmun's sacred reputation was, at least in part, hydrological. Bahrain is extraordinary among Gulf islands for the presence of natural freshwater springs, some of them submarine, bubbling up through the seabed in the shallow coastal waters, accessible to divers and boats in a region where fresh water was otherwise the most precious and precarious of resources. To a Mesopotamian sailor approaching this island across the harsh, salt-saturated Gulf, the sight and taste of fresh water rising from beneath the sea must have seemed genuinely miraculous. The stuff of which paradise is made. Qal'at al-Bahrain, the Bahrain fort, as it is known today, was built at the edge of these waters, positioned to command both the sea approaches and the freshwater resources that made the island so valuable. The Portuguese, arriving in the 16th century AD, built the most recent version of the fort, whose ruins now define the site's silhouette. But beneath their stonework lie the remains of civilizations stretching back 4,000 years: Dilmun, Tylos, the Sassanids, the Assyrians, the Kassites, each leaving its own stratum in the compressed record of the Tell. The Danish archaeological expeditions that began working the site in the 1950s spent decades carefully separating these layers, recovering artifacts that mapped the site's role as one of the ancient Gulf's primary trading entrepôts. Dilmun's merchants moved copper from Oman and the Indus Valley to Mesopotamia. They traded timber, ivory, carnelian, and the distinctive Dilmun weights and seals that appear in sites across the ancient Near East as evidence of commercial contact. The Dilmun seal, a distinctive stamp seal type found at sites from Mesopotamia to the Indus Valley, functioned in the ancient world something like a merchant's credential, a mark of trusted commercial identity recognized across an enormous geographic range. This was a small island at the center of a very large world. But the deeper question, and the one that the archaeology raises without fully answering, is about the mythological weight this place carried. Because the identification of Bahrain with the paradise of ancient Mesopotamian tradition is not merely a geographical curiosity. It places this specific shoreline, this specific mound of compressed human history, at the origin point of some of the most enduring narratives in human civilization. The Sumerian flood narrative, the tradition that scholars believe contributed to later versions found in the Epic of Gilgamesh and, ultimately, in the biblical account of Noah, places its hero, the flood survivor Ziusudra, in Dilmun after the waters recede. Here, on this island, the man who survived the end of the world was granted immortality by the gods and allowed to live in the Pure Land forever. The resonance of that placement is not subtle. Fringe researchers have embraced it enthusiastically, proposing Bahrain as the literal location of Eden, as the physical remnant of an antediluvian civilization of advanced capability, as the hub of a prehistoric maritime culture that seeded civilization across the ancient world before a catastrophic flood erased the evidence. Mainstream scholarship is, as always, more measured. The mythological identification of Dilmun with paradise is understood as a literary and religious tradition, not a literal geographic claim. The flood narratives of ancient Mesopotamia reflect, most researchers believe, cultural memories of genuine though regional flood events, filtered through millennia of mythological elaboration. But the questions the Fringe is responding to are not invented. Why did the ancient Mesopotamians place their paradise here specifically? What was it about this island, beyond its fresh water, beyond its trade value, that made it feel, to the people of the ancient world, like a place set apart? Like a place where the boundary between the human and the divine was somehow thinner than elsewhere. The tell of Qal'at al-Bahrain holds 12 meters of answers compressed into silence. Archaeologists have worked these layers for decades and acknowledge they have not reached the bottom. they do not yet know what the bottom holds. And beneath the Gulf waters surrounding this island, in the submarine geography that the rising seas of the post-glacial world swallowed thousands of years ago, there may be layers that no excavation has yet imagined reaching. The fresh water still rises from the seabed here, as it always has, as if the earth itself has not forgotten what this place once was and is still, quietly, trying to tell us. Qal'at al-Bahrain left us standing at the edge of something ancient and unresolved, a place where the earth itself still produces fresh water from beneath the sea, as if the land remembers what the written record has only partially preserved. But memory takes many forms in the ancient world. Sometimes it is encoded in architecture, sometimes in texts, sometimes in the careful placement of trade goods across thousands of miles of ocean and desert, and sometimes, simply directly, without translation, it is carved into stone and driven into the earth above the dead. In the grasslands of southern Ethiopia, roughly 160 kilometers south of Addis Ababa, where the landscape opens into wide, pale savanna broken by occasional acacia trees and the long shadows of afternoon light. There is a field of standing stones that stops you completely, not because of its scale. Tiya is not enormous by the standards of the megalithic world. It stops you because of what is on the stones. 36 stelae rise from the earth at Tiya, some standing, some tilted by time, some fallen and lying in the grass like sleeping figures. They range in height from less than a meter to nearly 3 meters. They are shaped, most of them, with a pointed top and a flattened face. Not the raw, unshaped uprights of the earliest megalithic traditions, but worked stones, deliberately formed, given a surface that was clearly intended to receive something. And on that surface, carved with a precision that speaks of practiced hands and understood conventions, are symbols, swords, or sword-like forms, long, straight, pointed shapes that researchers have generally interpreted as weapons, though the exact nature of what is depicted remains debated. Figures that may represent human forms, abstracted and stylized to the point where their humanity is suggested rather than stated. And most distinctively, most enigmatically, a symbol that appears repeatedly across the stelae, a form resembling a capital letter T or a cross with extended horizontal arms, whose meaning has not been conclusively determined by anyone studying the site. The symbols are not random. They follow conventions. They appear in consistent positions on the stones, in consistent combinations, suggesting a visual language, a system of meaning that was understood by those who carved it and by those who came to stand before it. A language that we cannot yet read. The stelae at Tiya mark graves. Excavations conducted in the 1930s and more systematically in the 1980s revealed burial pits beneath the stones containing human remains. In some cases, single individuals, in others, multiple bodies interred together. The burials show evidence of deliberate arrangement. Bodies placed in specific orientations. Grave goods, where they survived the acidic Ethiopian soil, suggesting individuals of some status or significance within their community. The dating of the site places its construction and primary use between approximately the 10th and 15th centuries AD, making Tiya medieval in its chronology, far more recent than the megalithic traditions of prehistoric Europe or the ancient Near East. This is not a prehistoric mystery in the conventional sense. These stones were raised by people living in a world that already contained writing, organized religion, and complex political structures. And yet they left no written explanation of what these stones mean. No chronicle identifies the people buried here. No inscription names them or describes the symbols carved above their heads. The oral traditions of the communities living in the surrounding region today retain fragments of memory about the stelae, references to ancestors, to warriors, to powerful individuals whose graves were marked to distinguish them from ordinary dead. But the specific content of the symbolic system, the precise meaning of each carved form, has not been transmitted in any form that researchers have been able to fully recover. The sword symbols are the most straightforward in their interpretation, and even they resist certainty. The most widely accepted reading associates them with male burials, the sword as a marker of warrior status, of masculine identity, of a role in life that was considered important enough to announce in death. Some stelae bear multiple sword symbols, which researchers have interpreted as indicating multiple kills in battle, or multiple years of distinguished service, or some other form of accumulated honor that the community wished to record permanently. But the T-shaped symbol, the form that appears with such consistency and such apparent importance, has not yielded to easy interpretation. Researchers have proposed various readings: a stylized human figure, arms extended, a representation of the deceased in a posture of ritual significance, a cosmological symbol representing the relationship between earth and sky, a marker of specific social or religious status within a community whose organizational structure we have not fully reconstructed. None of these proposals has achieved consensus. None has been confirmed by evidence sufficient to close the question. The broader stele tradition of which Tiya is a part extends across a wide region of southern Ethiopia, hundreds of sites, thousands of individual stones, spread across the landscape in patterns that suggest a culture of commemoration so deeply embedded in this society that it shaped the physical geography of the region for centuries. Tiya is among the most significant of these sites, recognized by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site in 1980, but it is not isolated. It is one node in a network of stone memory that stretches across the Ethiopian highlands in ways that have been only partially surveyed. Who were these people at the broader level? The culture or cultures responsible for the stele tradition? Their relationship to the known historical kingdoms of medieval Ethiopia is incompletely mapped. The Aksumite Empire, the dominant power of the earlier period, had its own sophisticated tradition of monumental stelae. The great obelisks of Aksum in the north are among the most celebrated monuments of ancient Africa. But the southern stele tradition, of which Tiya is part, appears distinct from the Aksumite forms in its symbolism, its geography, and its social context. Whether these represent a related tradition, adapted by different communities, or an entirely independent development arising from different cultural roots, remains an open question in Ethiopian archaeology, one that has received far less international scholarly attention than its significance warrants. Fringe researchers have connected the T-shaped symbol at Tiya to similar forms found in other ancient traditions: the Tau cross of early Christian iconography, the Ankh of ancient Egypt, the T-shaped pillars of Göbekli Tepe, proposing a shared prehistoric symbolic grammar encoding meanings that survived in fragmented form across thousands of years and thousands of miles. These connections are visually suggestive and evidentially thin. The appearance of similar simple geometric forms across unconnected cultures is more likely a reflection of the limited vocabulary of basic shapes than evidence of ancient communication. But the question of what the T-shaped symbol meant to the specific people who carved it at Tiya, what they were saying above the bodies of their dead in a language made of stone, is not a fringe question. It is an unanswered one. 36 stones stand in the Ethiopian grassland, marked with symbols that meant something precise and important to the hands that carved them. The grass moves around their bases in the afternoon wind. The symbols face outward, patient and legible to eyes that no longer exist, waiting for a translation that has not yet arrived. What were they trying to tell us about the people buried here? And what does it mean that we can see the language so clearly? its consistency, its convention, its evident intention, and still cannot read a single word. Tiya left us with symbols carved above the dead, a language of stone so consistent in its conventions, so evident in its intention that its silence feels almost deliberate. As if the people who carved it knew somehow that the meaning would eventually need to be recovered rather than simply read. There is something in that image that recurs across the ancient world, the deliberate encoding of meaning in forms that outlast the people who understood them. And sometimes the place that holds those forms is not a field, not a mountain, not a desert plateau. Sometimes it is water. In the Volta Lake of central Ghana, one of the largest artificial reservoirs in the world by surface area, created in 1965 by the damming of the Volta River, there is an island that most maps do not name, that most travelers do not visit, and that most histories of West Africa do not mention. It is called Pekli Island, and rising from its interior, half consumed by vegetation, partially submerged at its edges during high water, are the ruins of a settlement whose origins, whose purpose, and whose abandonment remain, in almost every essential detail, unclear. The lake that surrounds Pekli Island is not ancient. It was created within living memory. The Akosombo Dam, completed in 1965, flooded a vast stretch of the Volta River basin, displacing tens of thousands of people and submerging hundreds of villages, archaeological sites, and cultural landmarks that had existed in the valley for centuries. What the rising waters took, they took permanently. Most of what was lost was never properly documented before the flood. Pekli Island is what remained above the waterline, which means that what survives here is, in a very real sense, what the lake decided to spare. The ruins on Pekli Island consist of stone structures, walls, foundations, and what appear to be the remnants of larger buildings, arranged across the island's interior in patterns that suggest organized, deliberate settlement rather than casual or temporary occupation. The stonework, where it survives, shows evidence of skilled construction. Courses of stone fitted with care, walls substantial enough to have withstood centuries of the humid West African climate before the lake arrived to hasten their deterioration. The immediate question, who built this and when, does not have a clean answer. The broader region of what is now Ghana has a deep and complex history of settlement, state formation, and cultural development stretching back well over 1,000 years. The Volta Basin in particular served as a corridor of movement and exchange for multiple cultures across the medieval and early modern periods. The Akan states, the Gonja Kingdom, the various communities of the Volta River Valley, all left material traces in this landscape, and disentangling their overlapping presences is a task that requires sustained, careful archaeological work. That work has not been done at Pekli Island to the degree its significance may warrant. Part of the reason is access. The island sits in the middle of a large and occasionally unpredictable body of water, reachable only by boat, in a region where the infrastructure for systematic archaeological research has historically been limited. The communities displaced by the creation of Volta Lake carried with them oral traditions about the villages and sacred sites that were submerged, but the specific history of Pekli Island, whatever it was, has not surfaced clearly in the documented record. What has been noted by the researchers and travelers who have visited the site is the quality of the ruins, their solidity, their apparent scale relative to the island's size, and a sense difficult to articulate precisely that this was not a minor settlement. The placement of the structures on the island's highest ground, the orientation of certain walls, the presence of what may be a central enclosure or compound whose function is not immediately legible. These observations are impressionistic rather than systematic. Without proper excavation, without stratigraphic analysis, without the careful recovery and dating of material culture from beneath the surface, The ruins of Pekli Island cannot tell us what they actually are, but they can suggest, and what they suggest, to those who study the broader patterns of settlement in the Volta Basin, is a site of more than ordinary importance. Islands, in the spiritual geography of many West African cultures, occupy a particular cosmological position. They are threshold places, neither fully of the land nor of the water, existing at the boundary between two realms that carry different spiritual valences. Sacred groves, royal compounds, and ritual sites across West Africa were frequently located at precisely these kinds of liminal positions. Places where the ordinary rules of the everyday world were understood to be thinner, more permeable, more open to the forces that ordinary life was structured to keep at a manageable distance. Was Pekli Island a sacred site, a royal compound, a refuge, a trading post positioned to control movement along the river? All of these are possibilities. None can currently be confirmed. Fringe researchers, working from the limited available documentation, have proposed connections between Pekli Island and older traditions of settlement in the Volta Basin, suggesting the ruins may predate the historical kingdoms by centuries, representing evidence of an earlier phase of organized life in the region that mainstream West African historiography has not fully incorporated. Some have gone further, placing the island within speculative narratives about pre-colonial African civilizations of greater complexity and geographic reach than conventional histories acknowledge. The legitimate core of these proposals, that West African history before European contact was more complex, more urbanized, and more sophisticated than colonial-era scholarship credited, is not fringe at all. It is a correction that serious historians have been making for decades, as archaeological work across the continent continues to reveal the depth and complexity of African civilizational development. Whether Pekli Island is part of that story in a significant way remains to be determined. Because here is the honest reality of this site. We do not know enough. The lake that surrounds it has, in some ways, protected it, kept it isolated, kept development away, preserved what remains above the waterline from the kind of casual destruction that unprotected sites suffer. But the lake has also made it inaccessible, has kept the questions from being asked with the systematic rigor they deserve. And beneath the waterline, in the portions of the island that disappear beneath the surface during high water, in the submerged valley floor that surrounds it, where the original settlements of the Volta Basin were drowned in 1965, there may be evidence that changes the picture entirely. The lake gives nothing back easily. It took what it took in 1965, and it holds it still, beneath water the color of dark glass, in the permanent archive of the submerged. Pekli Island rises above that archive like a question mark, patient, surrounded, waiting for the research that has not yet arrived to finally ask it what it knows, and what it watched disappear beneath the water, on the day the dam closed and the valley began to fill, and the world that had existed here for centuries quietly drowned, remains, for now, a silence that the lake keeps entirely to itself. Pekli Island sits surrounded by water that took everything it could reach, a lake that swallowed a valley and left only questions above the waterline. But water is not the only force that erases. Time erases. Indifference erases. The slow, patient work of centuries upon abandoned stone, of sand carried by wind into empty rooms, of vegetation pressing through cracks in walls that no longer have anyone to maintain them. And sometimes what survives that erasure is more mysterious than what was lost, because sometimes what survives is an entire city. In the basalt desert of northeastern Jordan, where the volcanic rock plain known as the Herat extends toward the Syrian border in a landscape of such profound geological austerity that it seems designed to repel human presence, there is a city built entirely of black stone. Not dark stone, not gray stone, black. The basalt, from which every wall, every arch, every staircase and doorway and roof slab of el-Jimal was constructed, absorbs light in a way that gives the city, at certain hours, a quality that is almost atmospheric. In the low sun of morning and evening, the ruins glow a deep burnt amber. At midday, under the flat white light of a desert summer, they turn the color of charcoal. At dusk, they seem to merge with the darkening sky until the boundary between structure and horizon becomes difficult to locate. It is a city that looks like it grew from the ground rather than being placed upon it, as if the basalt desert simply decided, one day, to organize itself upward. el-Jimal, the name translates roughly as Mother of Camels, sits at an elevation of approximately 550 meters on a plateau that was, in the ancient world, far less barren than it appears today. The region sits at the edge of what was once a more productive agricultural zone, and the city's builders understood how to coax water from an ungenerous landscape with the same ingenuity we have seen at sites across this long journey: cisterns, channels, and a sophisticated rainwater harvesting system that collected and stored every drop that fell on the city's rooftops and streets. Without that system, el-Jimal could not have existed. With it, the city supported a population of perhaps 15,000 people at its peak. The site shows evidence of occupation beginning in the 1st century AD during the period of Nabatean dominance in the region. The Nabateans, the remarkable desert civilization whose capital at Petra remains one of the ancient world's most celebrated achievements, established el-Jimal as a way station on the trade routes that connected the Arabian Peninsula to the Mediterranean world. Incense, spices, silks, and the accumulated luxury goods of the Eastern trade passed through here, carried by the camel caravans whose memory is preserved in the city's name. Then Rome absorbed the Nabatean kingdom in 106 AD, and el-Jimal became a Roman frontier town, a node in the defensive and administrative network that Rome maintained along the eastern edge of its empire, where the settled agricultural world met the desert and the peoples who moved through it. The Romans built here, expanded here, left their architectural mark in the form of a military barracks, a praetorium, and the infrastructure of provincial administration that Rome replicated across its vast territorial holdings with the systematic efficiency of a civilization that understood, above all else, the value of standardization. And then the Romans withdrew, and the Byzantines arrived, and el-Jimal entered what was, by almost any measure, the most remarkable period of its long history. Between the 4th and 8th centuries AD, under Byzantine and then early Islamic governance, the city was transformed into something that no longer resembled a frontier outpost. It became a thriving, densely populated urban community. Its earlier military and administrative buildings converted, expanded, or demolished to make way for churches, houses, and the complex residential architecture of a city that had outgrown its original purpose and become something organic and self-sustaining. The buildings that survive from this period are extraordinary. Not for their decoration, el-Jimal is, in aesthetic terms, austere to the point of severity. The black basalt permits no frivolity. There are no painted surfaces here, no elaborate carved ornaments, no mosaic floors of the kind that grace the Byzantine churches of the Western Mediterranean. What el-Jimal offers instead is structural ingenuity of a remarkably high order. The builders developed, working entirely in basalt, a stone that cannot be easily cut into the thin slabs required for conventional arch construction, a series of corbelling and spanning techniques that allowed them to roof large spaces without timber. In a region where wood was scarce and expensive, this was not an aesthetic choice but a necessity, and the solutions they arrived at are, even to modern structural engineers who have studied them, impressive in their inventiveness. Rooms were roofed with overlapping stone slabs, Staircases were cantilevered from walls in ways that distribute load with elegant efficiency. Multi-story buildings, some apparently reaching 3 or 4 stories, were constructed using techniques that maintained structural integrity across centuries of seismic activity and the thermal expansion and contraction of stone in a climate of extreme temperature variation. These buildings did not fall down, they were abandoned, and then they stood empty for over 1,000 years, which is itself a mystery worth pausing on. At some point in the 8th century AD, following the transition to Umayyad governance of the region, el-Jimal was gradually depopulated. The reasons are, in the familiar pattern of these investigations, not fully established. Some researchers point to the catastrophic earthquake of 749 AD, which devastated much of the Levant and Jordan and depopulated numerous settlements across the region simultaneously. Others suggest shifts in trade routes, changes in agricultural productivity, administrative reorganization under the early Islamic Caliphate. What is clear is that by the 9th century the city was largely empty, and what is extraordinary is how completely it survived that emptiness. el-Jimal was not robbed of its stone in the way that so many ancient sites were, picked apart over centuries by later builders who found a convenient quarry in someone else's ruins. The basalt, heavy and difficult to transport, and the remoteness of the site from major population centers conspired to leave the city largely intact. Walls still stand to their original height in many places. Doorways still hold their lintels. The corbelled roofs in dozens of buildings are still in place. Walking through el-Jimal today is, more than at almost any other ancient site, genuinely disorienting. It does not feel like a ruin in the conventional sense, a place of fragments and foundations, and the imagination required to reconstruct what once stood. It feels like a city whose inhabitants left last week, as if the daily life that filled these rooms has merely paused temporarily and might resume at any moment. That quality of suspended animation raises questions that archaeology alone does not fully answer. The inscriptions found at el-Jimal are numerous and varied. Greek, Latin, Nabatean, and early Arabic texts that record dedications, names, and administrative details across the city's long history. Among them is one of the earliest known examples of written Arabic, a 4th century inscription that sits at the very beginning of the documented history of a script that would eventually become one of the most widely used writing systems in the world. The significance of that inscription is not lost on researchers. It places el-Jimal at a pivotal moment in the history of human communication, at the point where a script was transitioning from regional use to something with the potential for much wider reach. Why here? Why in this black stone city on a basalt plateau at the edge of the desert? The answer likely lies in el-Jimal's position at the intersection of multiple cultural worlds: Nabatean, Roman, Byzantine, Arabian, where different languages and scripts were in daily contact, where traders and soldiers and administrators moved through speaking half a dozen languages, where the need to communicate across linguistic boundaries was constant and practical. Fringe researchers have placed less emphasis on the inscriptions and more on the city's overall layout, proposing that the organization of el-Jimal's streets and buildings reflects a geometric precision that exceeds what pure practical necessity would require. Some have suggested astronomical alignments in the orientation of major structures. Others have connected the city to speculative traditions about the ancient roads of the Nabateans, proposing that the trade routes they maintained encoded geographic and astronomical knowledge in their paths that mainstream archaeology has not fully investigated. These proposals remain at the edge of what the evidence supports. But the legitimate question of how much we have yet to learn about the Nabateans, a civilization of extraordinary sophistication, whose water engineering, astronomical knowledge and geographic reach remain only partially understood, is not a fringe question at all. It is one that every excavation season at sites like el-Jimal brings incrementally closer to an answer. The Black City stands in its desert, patient as the basalt from which it was made. Its empty rooms hold the quality of light in a way that changes hour by hour. Amber at dawn, charcoal at noon. Something approaching warmth again as the sun descends. 15,000 people lived here once. They wrote in languages that transitioned between worlds. They roofed their houses with stone so skillfully that the roofs still hold. They harvested every drop of rain from a sky that offered little, and they built a city that has outlasted every civilization that claimed it. What did they understand about this place, about this specific patch of black desert, at this specific intersection of worlds? That made it worth building here at all. And in the rooms that still stand, in the inscriptions that still wait for fuller interpretation, in the geometry of streets that the sand has not yet managed to erase. What is el-Jimal still trying to say? El-Jimal left us with the image of a city that simply stopped, its rooms still standing, its roofs still holding, its inscriptions still legible in languages that bridged worlds. A place whose abandonment feels less like an ending than a pause. But some cities did not pause. Some cities ended. Not gradually, not through the slow attrition of depopulation and neglect, but with a violence and a finality so complete that the moment of ending was pressed into the earth itself, preserved in the archaeological record with the terrible precision of a photograph. In the Sindh province of modern Pakistan, on a flat plain beside the Indus River, there is a district of one of the ancient world's greatest cities where that moment of ending was found. It is called the DK Area of Mohenjo-daro. And what was discovered there, in the excavations of the 1920s and 1930s, produced one of the most enduring and contested mysteries in the entire archaeology of South Asia. Mohenjo-daro itself needs a moment of context, because its scale and sophistication have still not been fully absorbed into the popular understanding of the ancient world. At its peak, between approximately 2500 and 1900 BC, this was one of the largest cities on Earth, home to perhaps 40,000 people, laid out on a grid of streets with a geometric regularity that would not appear again in urban planning for another 2,000 years. It had a sewage system more comprehensive than anything in contemporary Egypt or Mesopotamia. Standardized brick sizes used consistently across the entire city. A great bath of waterproofed brick whose function, ritual, civic, administrative, remains debated. Public buildings of evident institutional significance whose purpose has not been conclusively identified. And it had no obvious rulers. No palace has been identified at Mohenjo-daro. No royal tomb, no monument to a named king or dynasty. No battlefield reliefs celebrating military conquest. No iconography of dominance of the kind that saturates the archaeological records of contemporary Egypt and Mesopotamia. Whatever organized this city, whatever authority planned its streets, standardized its weights and measures, maintained its drainage infrastructure, and coordinated the lives of tens of thousands of people, left no image of itself that we have yet found. That absence is itself a profound mystery. But it is not the one that the DK area presents. The DK area, one of the residential districts of Mohenjo-daro, located in the lower city, was excavated in the 1920s by the Archaeological Survey of India under Ernest Mackay. What Mackay and his team found in the streets and buildings of this district has been generating debate ever since. Human skeletons. Not in graves, not in the formal burial positions that indicate deliberate ceremonial interment, but in streets, in doorways, on staircases, in rooms. Arranged, if that is even the right word, in the postures of people who fell where they were and were never moved. 37 skeletons were recovered from the DK area and its immediate vicinity during the early excavations. Some lay in groups, as if they had fallen together. Some showed evidence of injuries consistent with violent trauma. They were found at the uppermost occupation level of the site, the final layer of habitation before the city went silent. The image these remains conjure is not of a planned abandonment, not of a population that gathered its belongings and moved on in an orderly transition to somewhere else. It is the image of people who did not have time to leave. The mainstream archaeological interpretation of Mohenjo-daro's decline frames it as a gradual process driven primarily by environmental factors: the shifting of the Indus River and its tributaries, changing monsoon patterns, the depletion of agricultural resources across a region that had been intensively farmed for centuries. In this reading, the city did not end suddenly. It declined over generations, its population slowly reducing, its infrastructure gradually failing, until what remained at the final occupation level was a city already deeply diminished from its peak, a skeleton community inhabiting the ruins of a former greatness. The skeletons of the DK area, in this interpretation, represent the last inhabitants, people too poor, too old, too marginalized to participate in whatever migration had carried the majority of the population elsewhere. Their unburied state reflects not a sudden massacre, but the simple absence of anyone left to perform the burial. This is a reasonable interpretation. It is supported by evidence of long-term decline visible in the archaeological stratigraphy, but it has never fully silenced the alternative, because the skeletons of the DK area have a quality that the gradual decline narrative struggles to accommodate. Their distribution, scattered across public spaces, found in positions of apparent flight or collapse rather than repose, is more consistent, some researchers have argued, with sudden catastrophe than with the quiet dying of the already diminished. And then there is the question that a British archaeologist named Mortimer Wheeler raised in the 1940s, which generated decades of controversy and has never been entirely resolved. Wheeler noted the skeletal evidence and proposed that Mohenjo-daro's end was violent, that the city was attacked and its final inhabitants massacred by invaders moving into the subcontinent from the northwest. He connected this proposed invasion to the broader hypothesis of an Aryan migration into South Asia, suggesting that the collapse of the Indus Valley civilization was a direct result of conquest by incoming Indo-European speaking peoples. This interpretation was, for decades, enormously influential. It has also been substantially challenged. Later analysis of the skeletal remains found no consistent evidence of weapon injuries of the kind a massacre would produce. The bones showed various causes of death, including disease, rather than the uniform trauma expected from a violent assault. The geographic distribution of the skeletons did not clearly indicate a pattern of people fleeing a specific direction of attack. And the broader hypothesis of a dramatic, violent Aryan invasion of South Asia has been significantly complicated by genetic, linguistic, and archaeological research over the past several decades, replaced in most scholarly frameworks by more nuanced models of gradual migration and cultural exchange. The massacre theory, in its original Wheeler formulation, is no longer the mainstream position, but it has not been replaced by a fully satisfying alternative, because the bodies are still there, still found in positions that resist comfortable explanation, still refusing to arrange themselves into the neat pattern of gradual, peaceful decline. The most intriguing physical evidence associated with the DK area is not, in fact, the skeletons themselves, but something else entirely. Evidence that has generated more speculative heat than almost anything else in Indus Valley archaeology. During excavations, researchers noted areas of the site where the ancient mud brick appeared to have been vitrified, fused, in a way that ordinary fire does not produce, into a glass-like material requiring temperatures far beyond those achievable by conventional ancient combustion. Scattered black stones with unusual properties were found in the vicinity, and a peculiar radial pattern in the distribution of certain remains prompted at least one researcher to propose in the 1970s and 1980s that what ended Mohenjo-daro was not invasion, not environmental collapse, not gradual decline, but an explosion, an ancient nuclear event. This proposal, associated most prominently with the writer David Davenport, who published a book on the subject in 1979, drew on the DK area evidence and on references in ancient Sanskrit texts, particularly the Mahabharata, to descriptions of devastating weapons capable of producing blasts of terrible heat and force. The proposal received significant popular attention and has circulated persistently in fringe literature ever since. It has not received support from the scientific or archaeological community. The vitrification evidence, when examined by material scientists, has been attributed to conventional causes: the repeated, intense burning of organic materials in confined spaces over long periods of occupation. The black stones have not been confirmed as evidence of extreme heat events. The Sanskrit texts, read carefully, describe weapons that are extraordinary within their mythological context, but do not constitute evidence of literal nuclear technology. And the physics of what an ancient nuclear event would actually leave in the archaeological record are incompatible with what was found at Mohenjo-daro. The ancient nuclear hypothesis is not supported by evidence. But the questions it emerged from, what happened in the DK area, what the skeletons in the streets represent, what produced the final occupation level of one of the ancient world's greatest cities, are not fringe questions. They are real ones. And they remain, in the most honest assessment of what the archaeology has established, incompletely answered. What we know is this: a city of extraordinary sophistication, home to tens of thousands of people, one of the great achievements of the ancient world in any continent, declined and ended sometime around 1900 BC. In one of its residential districts, the bodies of its final inhabitants were found in positions that speak of something sudden and terrible. The civilization of which it was a part, the Indus Valley civilization, with its standardized bricks and its undeciphered script and its mysterious absence of royal iconography, collapsed across a wide geographic area within a relatively short period. And we do not fully understand why. The DK area streets are quiet now. The excavated ruins bake under the Pakistani sun, slowly deteriorating despite ongoing preservation efforts. The skeletons have been removed, studied, archived. The buildings in which they fell have been partially reconstructed for visitors who walk between the ancient walls and try to imagine what life looked like here 4,000 years ago, before whatever it was arrived. 37 people fell in these streets and were not buried. Someone should have buried them. The fact that no one did, that no one came back, that no community reformed itself in the aftermath to perform that most basic of human obligations, tells us something about how completely the end came. What we do not yet know is what the end was. And somewhere beneath the unexcavated portions of Mohenjo-daro, beneath the layers that the 1920s excavations never reached, beneath the water table that now threatens the site's survival, the answer may still be waiting, patient as the dead, undisturbed as the city that kept their secret for 4,000 years before anyone thought to ask. Mohenjo-daro left us with unanswered deaths, bodies in streets, an ending pressed into the earth with a force that 4,000 years of subsequent history has not managed to fully explain. There is something in that image that follows you, the sense that the most important moments, The moments that determine everything that comes after are precisely the ones that leave the least clear record. That history's sharpest turns happen in the spaces between what was written down, in the rooms where no scribe was present, in the streets where the only witnesses were people who did not survive to give their account. Rome understood this better than most. The Roman Empire was, among its many other qualities, a civilization of extraordinary documentary sophistication. It produced historians, archivists, legal records, administrative correspondence, and monumental inscriptions at a scale that no previous civilization had approached. It was a world that believed deeply in the power of the written record, in the ability of text to fix reality, to establish truth, to make permanent what would otherwise dissolve into the unreliable medium of memory. And yet, Rome also understood that some things were better kept out of the record entirely. Some people were better kept where no record could reach them. In the high Apennine Mountains of central Italy, in the Abruzzo region approximately 100 kilometers east of Rome, at an elevation of nearly 1,000 meters on a plateau that commands a wide view of the surrounding valleys, there is a Roman city that has been almost entirely forgotten by popular history. Its name is Alba Fucens, and its history begins with a purpose that Rome rarely advertised openly. The purpose of a place specifically designed to make certain people disappear. The city was founded as a Latin colony in 303 BC, positioned at a strategic point in the Apennine road network that connected Rome to the Adriatic coast and the regions beyond. Its location was chosen with the cold practicality that characterized Roman territorial expansion. A high, defensible plateau, easily supplied, commanding the routes through a mountainous region that Rome was in the process of absorbing into its growing sphere of control. For several centuries, Alba Fucens functioned as a standard Roman colonial city, with a forum, temples, an amphitheater, baths, and the regular infrastructure of provincial Roman life. Archaeology has revealed the outlines of all of these, well preserved beneath the surface of a landscape that has seen relatively little modern development, partially because the 1915 Avezzano earthquake devastated the region and shifted subsequent settlement patterns away from the ancient site. The ruins that remain are substantial. The polygonal limestone walls of the ancient city, built in the massive irregular block style known as opus incurtum, survive to considerable height in several places. Thick, heavy, built for permanence in a way that goes beyond what simple civic defense would require. The amphitheater retains much of its structure. The Temple of Hercules, converted in the medieval period into the Church of San Pietro, rises above the site with the layered authority of a building that has served multiple masters across 2,000 years. But it is not the temples, or the amphitheater, or the forum that make Alba Fucens historically singular. It is the prisoners. Beginning in the 3rd century BC, Rome began using Alba Fucens for a purpose that appears in the historical sources with a casualness that is itself revealing. As if sending powerful, dangerous, or politically inconvenient individuals to this remote mountain city was simply a standard administrative practice, unremarkable enough to mention without elaboration. The first recorded prisoner of note was Perseus of Macedon. Perseus was the last king of the Macedonian Empire, the successor state to the conquests of Alexander the Great, the last independent power in Greece and the Aegean. After his defeat at the Battle of Pydna in 168 BC, which effectively ended Macedonian independence and established Roman dominance over the Greek world, Perseus was brought to Rome as a trophy of war, paraded through the streets in Aemilius Paulus's triumph. And then he was sent to Alba Fucens, not executed, not displayed, not ransomed or exchanged, simply placed. In this mountain city, far enough from Rome to be inaccessible to any political faction that might find use for him, close enough to be maintained and monitored without excessive logistical difficulty. He died there, in circumstances the sources describe variously and contradictorily. Some accounts suggest he was deliberately deprived of sleep, a form of torture that leaves no marks and produces death with a clinical efficiency that Rome's legal sensibilities around the treatment of royal prisoners could accommodate without obvious scandal. Others suggest natural causes in the psychological devastation of captivity. What the sources agree on is that he died at Alba Fucens, removed from the world, removed from history, placed in the kind of silence that remote mountain cities are very good at producing. Perseus was not the last. Syphax, the Numidian king whose alliance with Carthage made him a Roman enemy, was held at Alba Fucens before his death in captivity. Bituitus, the Arverni chieftain whose tribe in Gaul had clashed with Roman expansion, was sent here despite the protests of Roman senators who considered his capture and imprisonment a violation of the diplomatic conventions that were supposed to govern such situations. The Senate, in the case of Bituitus, debated the propriety of what they were doing. They sent him to Alba Fucens anyway. This pattern, the repeated use of this specific city for the detention of specific categories of prisoner, was not accidental. Alba Fucens was not simply the nearest available secure location to Rome. It was a deliberate choice, repeated across generations of Roman policy, suggesting that the city possessed qualities that Rome valued for this particular purpose. The elevation was part of it. The mountain air, the cold winters, the physical isolation from the networks of communication and patronage that made Roman political life function. All of these made Alba Fucens effective as a place of removal. But there is something else in the archaeological and historical record that invites closer attention. The prisoners sent to Alba Fucens were not ordinary criminals. They were not common enemies. They were, almost without exception, individuals whose existence represented a political problem of a specific kind, the existence of an alternative legitimacy, a deposed king, a captured chieftain, a figure around whom resistance might crystallize, loyalty might cohere, a challenge to Roman authority might organize itself. These were people whose presence in the world was itself a form of power. And Rome put them here, in a city whose walls were built thicker than military necessity required, in a city positioned precisely at the point where the road network of the Central Apennines could be monitored and controlled, in a city that appears, in the architectural evidence, to have been designed not just for habitation, but for a kind of comprehensive oversight that goes beyond what ordinary colonial administration would require. Was Alba Fucens, from its founding, intended for this purpose? Did Rome establish a Latin colony on this remote mountain plateau in 303 BC, already anticipating the need for a place of this kind? The historical sources do not answer this question directly, but the pattern of its use, the consistency with which it appears in accounts of politically sensitive imprisonment across more than 2 centuries, suggests that its suitability for this purpose was recognized and exploited very early in the city's history. Fringe researchers have taken the question further, proposing that Alba Fucens represents evidence of a systematic Roman policy of political disappearance, a deliberate, institutionalized practice of removing inconvenient figures from the historical record by placing them in locations specifically designed to be forgotten. Some have suggested that the prisoners documented in the historical sources represent only the most visible cases, that beneath the named individuals whose fates were recorded because they were too prominent to ignore entirely, there were others whose names never made it into the record at all. This proposal cannot be confirmed. The absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, and the argument from silence is methodologically precarious. But the question it raises is legitimate. How many people were sent here whose names we do not know? How many political inconveniences? How many alternative legitimacies? How many threats to the Roman order were quietly resolved by a transfer to this mountain city and a subsequent silence in the sources? The archaeological record cannot answer this. The historical sources, by definition, record only what was considered worth recording. What was considered not worth recording, what Rome actively chose to leave unwritten, is precisely the category of thing that Alba Fucens was built to accommodate. The walls of the city still stand on their mountain plateau, thick and cold and extraordinarily well preserved for structures of their age. The view from the site extends across the valley of the former Lake Fucino, drained in the 19th century in one of the great land reclamation projects of modern Italy, its former lake bed now flat agricultural land stretching to the surrounding mountains. In the ancient period, the lake was there, filling the valley, completing the sense of elevation and separation that the plateau already provided. A city above a lake in the mountains, at the edge of the world that mattered. A city where kings went to be forgotten. And in the thick walls and the cold mountain air and the official silence of the historical record on everything it was not convenient to preserve, Alba Fucens keeps its count of everyone who arrived here, and of how many, after arriving, simply ceased to exist in any form that history thought worth remembering. How many names does this mountain know that the sources chose not to write down? And what stories ended here, in this cold, elevated, deliberate silence that the stones have kept entirely to themselves? Alba Fucens kept its secrets through official silence, a city that Rome built partly to ensure that certain names, certain stories, certain inconvenient existences would never make it into the record that history would eventually read. But official silence requires infrastructure. It requires walls. It requires distance. It requires the kind of remoteness that puts something beyond the reach of the curious, the sympathetic, the politically motivated, beyond the reach, ultimately, of memory itself. Rome found that remoteness in the Apennines. And on the other side of the ancient world, in a mountain valley so high and so isolated that it exists in a category of remoteness that the Italian highlands cannot approach, someone else built something whose purpose has been generating disagreement for centuries. Not because the evidence is absent, but because the evidence points simultaneously in too many directions. In the Tian Shan mountains of what is now the Kyrgyz Republic, at an elevation of approximately 3,200 meters in a valley called the Atbashi Range, there is a building that should not be here. Not because it is impossible to reach, but because everything about its construction, its scale, its sophistication, its architectural ambition, exceeds what the conventional history of this location would lead anyone to expect. The building is called Tash Rabat, and it rises from the high mountain grassland with a self-contained completeness that is immediately, powerfully arresting. The structure is built entirely of dark gray stone, a single massive domed complex approximately 35 meters square, its exterior walls still standing to near their original height, its central dome still intact after what researchers estimate to be somewhere between 500 and 1,000 years of existence at altitude, in one of the most climatically demanding environments in Central Asia. Winters here are severe beyond ordinary measure. Snow accumulates to depths that would collapse conventional construction. The freeze-thaw cycles that attack masonry are relentless and unforgiving. Tash Rabat has endured all of it. The interior of the building is a labyrinth of interconnected rooms, approximately 31 chambers of various sizes, arranged around a central domed hall that rises to a height of approximately 8 meters. The rooms branch from the central space in a pattern that is more complex than it initially appears, corridors leading to secondary chambers, some of which contain niches of uncertain function, some of which descend via stone steps to lower levels that remain inadequately explored. The craftsmanship throughout is of a quality that commands attention. The stonework is precise. The arches are correctly proportioned and structurally sound. The dome, which uses a pendentive construction technique to transition from the square base to the circular crown, demonstrates a knowledge of architectural engineering that was not universally available in the medieval period, and whose presence at this altitude and in this geographic context raises immediate questions about who built this and what tradition of knowledge they carried with them to this valley. The most widely accepted identification of Tash Rabat is as a caravanserai, a way station on the Silk Road trade routes that cross the Tian Shan Mountains, providing shelter, security, and rest for the merchants, diplomats, pilgrims, and travelers who moved goods and ideas between China and the Mediterranean world across Central Asia's formidable mountain barriers. This identification is reasonable and supported by the building's location. The At-Bashi Valley sits on one of the high mountain passes connecting the Fergana Valley in the west to the Tarim Basin in the east, a route that was used for Silk Road traffic despite its elevation, because it offered certain advantages in terms of security and the availability of water and grazing. A substantial, well-constructed shelter at this point on the route would have been enormously valuable to anyone attempting the crossing, particularly in the shoulder seasons when the mountain weather was unpredictable and the consequences of being caught without shelter at 3,000 meters were potentially fatal. The caravanserai interpretation is mainstream and defensible, but it leaves questions open. The first is chronological. The dating of Tash Rabat is genuinely contested. Most researchers place its construction somewhere in the 15th century AD, during the period when Timurid or possibly Chagatai Khanate influence extended into this region. Some have argued for an earlier date, 10th or 11th century, which would place its construction in the period of the Karakhanid Khanate that controlled much of Central Asia during the early medieval period. A minority of researchers have proposed that the current structure incorporates or was built upon the foundations of an even earlier building, possibly a Nestorian Christian monastery dating to the 5th or 6th century AD. This last proposal deserves more than passing attention. Nestorian Christianity, the form of Christian theology that developed in the Eastern Church following the Council of Ephesus in 431 AD and was declared heretical by the Western Church, did not simply disappear after its condemnation. It moved east. Carried by missionaries of extraordinary determination and geographic ambition, Nestorian Christianity spread across Persia, Central Asia, and eventually reached China, where a famous stone stele erected in 781 AD in the Tang capital of Chang'an records the arrival of the faith in the Chinese heartland. Along the routes that those missionaries traveled, through exactly the mountain passes that Tash Rabat guards, they established monasteries, wayhouses, and communities of faith in some of the most remote landscapes on Earth. The archaeological evidence for an earlier Nestorian presence at Tash Rabat is suggestive but not conclusive. Certain features of the building's layout have been interpreted as consistent with church architecture. The orientation of the central space, the arrangement of certain chambers, the presence of what may be a baptismal font in one of the lower rooms. A cross-shaped decorative element was reportedly observed in the structure by early European travelers, though its current visibility is unclear. None of this constitutes proof. The evidence for a Nestorian foundation at Tash Rabat is, in the honest assessment of current scholarship, intriguing rather than established. But it opens a door onto a larger question that is both legitimate and inadequately studied. What was the full extent of Nestorian Christian presence in the high Tian Shan? How far into these mountains did the missionaries reach, and what did they build there? The communities they established left traces that have been only partially surveyed, in a region that was, for much of the 20th century, inaccessible to Western researchers due to Soviet control of Central Asia. The archives that might illuminate this history are only now beginning to be systematically explored. Tash Rabat sits at the intersection of these questions in a way that makes it more than a single building. It is a node in a network of routes, communities, and cultural exchanges whose full complexity has not yet been mapped. The Silk Road, as a concept, is well understood in its broad outlines. Goods moved east and west. Ideas traveled with the goods. Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, Zoroastrianism all moved along these routes, establishing communities, building structures, and leaving material traces in landscapes that seemed to defy habitation. What is less well understood is the texture of that movement at the level of specific places. What happened at Tash Rabat specifically? Who stopped here over how many centuries? In service of what faiths and what commercial interests and what political missions? What conversations happened in its central domed hall? What decisions were made here that affected the movement of goods and ideas across the mountain barrier between east and west? The rooms of Tash Rabat have no written record of their occupants. The walls carry no inscriptions, no graffiti, no accumulated testimony of the thousands of people who must have sheltered here across the centuries. In a building designed for transit, for the temporary accommodation of people who were always on their way to somewhere else, this is perhaps not surprising. Travelers rarely leave records, they leave footprints. And at 3,200 meters, even footprints don't last long. Fringe researchers have proposed that Tash Rabat's complexity, the number of its rooms, the sophistication of its construction, the presence of the lower-level chambers with their uncertain function, indicates a purpose beyond simple wayside accommodation. Some have suggested it served as a center of clandestine religious practice, a place where outlawed faiths could maintain their traditions beyond the reach of the powers that had condemned them. Others have connected it to speculative traditions about hidden knowledge carried along the Silk Road. Ancient texts, astronomical records, mathematical systems moving in both directions along the route, and cached in high mountain buildings where the climate preserved what the lowland political situation threatened. These proposals exceed what the evidence supports. But the question of what Tash Rabat was actually used for, across the full span of its existence, is not a fringe question. It is simply unanswered. The building stands in its valley as the seasons turn around it. The high summer when the surrounding grassland turns a green so vivid it seems almost artificial. The autumn when the first snows arrive and the passes close. The long winter when the building sits entirely alone in a landscape of white and gray, and the wind that knows no obstruction for 100 miles in any direction. And in the spring, when the passes open again and the valley returns to the possibility of passage, it is still there, waiting for the next traveler, as it has always waited. Holding in its stone chambers the accumulated silence of everyone who ever stopped here. Merchants and missionaries, diplomats and refugees, people carrying goods and people carrying ideas and people carrying nothing but the urgent need to get from one side of the mountain to the other before the weather closed in. All of them passing through, none of them staying, and none of them in all those centuries of transit, leaving behind enough to tell us what this building truly was. What did those lower chambers hold? And who decided, at some point in the long history of this valley, that the secret of this building's original purpose was better kept than shared? Tash Rabat asked us to consider what a building holds beyond its apparent function, how a structure designed for transit might contain, within its stone chambers and unanswered lower rooms, a history far more layered than its surface suggests. That question does not resolve itself when we leave the Tian Shan Mountains. It follows us westward, across the great continental interior of Asia, past the Caspian's eastern shore, down through the elevated plateaus of the Iranian highlands, into the central desert of what is now Iran, a landscape so vast, so consistently inhospitable, so stripped of the features that ordinary human habitation requires, that its very emptiness becomes a kind of presence. The Dashti Kavir, the great salt desert, one of the most forbidding landscapes on Earth. And in the middle of it, positioned with a precision that suggests careful geographic calculation rather than accident, a caravanserai that has been standing since the 3rd century AD. Its name is Sarab-e Bahram, and from the moment you understand where it is and how long it has been there, the questions begin. The structure rises from the flat desert floor with the self-contained authority of something that was built to outlast everything around it. Its walls, constructed from the fired brick that Sasanian imperial engineers used with such consistency across their vast territorial holdings, stand to considerable height in multiple sections, enough that the building's original form can be reconstructed with reasonable confidence despite the centuries of abandonment and the particular violence that the desert does to unprotected masonry. The plan is recognizably that of a caravanserai, a roughly square enclosure with a central courtyard, flanked by a series of chambers arranged around the interior perimeter, with an entrance gateway of sufficient scale to accommodate the loaded camels that were the primary vehicles of trade across the Iranian plateau. The formula was standardized across the Silk Road world for practical reasons. It worked. It provided security, shelter, water storage, and the spatial organization needed to manage the complex logistics of large trading caravans that might include hundreds of animals and dozens of people. Sarab-e Bahram fits this formula, but it also departs from it in ways that have generated sustained scholarly interest. The building's association with Bahram II, the Sasanian emperor who ruled from 276 to 293 AD, is established not through historical texts but through something more immediately striking. Carved into the rock faces of a low cliff formation a short distance from the caravanserai itself are a series of rock reliefs, monumental carvings in the Sasanian tradition that depict the emperor in scenes of reception, triumph, and most significantly, the royal hunt. The hunting scenes are extraordinary in their detail and their ambition. Bahram II appears on horseback, bow drawn, surrounded by the animals of the hunt, lions, wild boar, deer, in compositions that follow the conventions of Sasanian royal iconography, with a sophistication that speaks of court artists working at the height of their tradition. The king is depicted with the controlled power of absolute authority, larger than his companions, centered in each composition, his form carrying the specific visual language of Sasanian divine kingship that connected the ruler to the cosmic order through his mastery of the natural world. These are not casual carvings, they are statements, political, theological, and artistic statements made in stone, in one of the most remote and inhospitable locations in the Sasanian Empire, where the audience for such statements would have been, by any conventional logic, essentially non-existent. And that is where the questions begin to accumulate. Why here? The conventional explanation for the combination of caravanserai and royal rock reliefs at Sarab-e Bahram frames it as an imperial way station on a route that Bahram II used for desert hunting expeditions. A tradition of royal recreation that served simultaneously as a demonstration of personal valor, a ritualized enactment of cosmic order, and a practical method of maintaining physical fitness and martial readiness in a culture where the king was also the supreme military commander. The Sasanian kings were, by consistent historical account, passionate hunters. The hunt was not leisure in the modern sense, it was sacred duty, a performance of the king's relationship with the forces of nature, and the divine mandate that authorized his rule. The great Sasanian silver plates that survive in museum collections across the world depict hunting scenes with a frequency and a reverence that confirm the centrality of this activity to Sasanian royal ideology. A hunting lodge in the desert, with an attached caravanserai to support the royal retinue and the supply chains that a desert expedition required. This interpretation is coherent, well supported by the iconographic evidence, and accepted by mainstream scholarship as the primary explanation for Sarab-e Bahram's existence. But coherent explanations and complete explanations are not always the same thing. Because the rock reliefs at Sarab-e Bahram contain, alongside the hunting scenes, compositions that carry a different register of meaning entirely. One of the most significant panels depicts what scholars describe as a scene of royal investiture or divine reception. Bahram II receiving the ring of kingship from a divine figure, in a composition that encodes the foundational Zoroastrian theology of Sasanian power. The king rules because the divine has chosen him. His authority is not political but cosmic. The ring he receives is not merely a symbol of office, but a connection to the sacred fire that Zoroastrian theology places at the center of the universe. This scene, carved in the desert where almost no one would see it, raises a question that goes beyond the practical. Why engrave the theological foundation of your kingship on a cliff face in the Dasht Kavir? If the audience for these reliefs was the royal hunting party, a group of courtiers and military commanders who already understood, deeply and from birth, the theological basis of Sasanian rule, what was the purpose of this articulation? Some researchers have proposed that the desert reliefs were not intended for human audiences in the ordinary sense, that they functioned as communications of a different kind, declarations made to the landscape itself, to the divine forces that Zoroastrian theology understood as inhabiting and animating the natural world. In this reading, carving the king's divine mandate into the rock of the desert was an act of cosmic inscription, a way of writing authority into the fabric of the world itself, rather than merely asserting it in the temporary medium of human political life. This interpretation is speculative, and mainstream scholarship treats it cautiously. But it points toward something real about Sasanian religious practice, the understanding that sacred acts performed in specific landscapes had a power that the same acts performed elsewhere would lack. The desert, in many ancient Near Eastern religious traditions, was not simply empty space. It was a liminal zone, a place where the boundary between the human world and the divine was thinner than elsewhere, where communication with forces beyond ordinary reach was more possible, more direct, more consequential. Did Bahram II come to this specific desert not merely to hunt, but to perform rituals whose location was as important as their content? The caravanseray's water system offers a practical dimension that the religious interpretation alone does not account for. The structure includes a sophisticated cistern and water management system of the kind that Sasanian engineers deployed across the Iranian plateau, evidence that the site was designed for sustained occupation rather than occasional royal visits. The scale of the water storage implies a level of use, over time, that exceeds what a periodic hunting expedition would require. Who else was here? Who used this place between royal visits, if royal visits were indeed the primary occasion for its construction? The trade route that passes through this area, connecting the settlements of the Iranian heartland to the desert crossing toward the east, would have seen regular traffic independent of any royal activity. Merchants, pilgrims, government couriers, military supply trains, all of the human movement that sustained the Sasanian Empire's vast administrative and commercial network would have passed through or near this location, and some of them would have stopped here. What did they make of the reliefs carved into the rock beside their overnight shelter? Fringe researchers have proposed that the desert location of Sarab-e Bahram was chosen not for hunting access or route logistics, but for astronomical reasons, that the site sits at a point in the landscape that has specific significance within an ancient system of sacred geography, whose principles are no longer fully understood. Some have connected the Sasanian hunting imagery to older Iranian traditions of stellar mythology, in which the lion, the boar, and the deer figure as celestial as well as terrestrial creatures, and in which the royal hunt enacted, at the level of physical performance, a cosmic drama whose real stage was the night sky. These proposals are not supported by the current archaeological evidence in any direct way, but the question of what Sasanian royal ritual actually meant, at its deepest theological level, in its most private performances, stripped of the public ceremony that the historical sources describe, is a question that remains genuinely open. The Zoroastrian religious tradition that animated Sasanian culture is incompletely transmitted. Its sacred texts were substantially destroyed during the Islamic conquest of Iran in the 7th century AD, and what survives represents a fraction of what once existed. The full theological system that the Sasanian kings inhabited, the complete understanding of how their ritual actions connected to the cosmic forces their religion described, is no longer entirely recoverable. Sarab-e Bahram stands in its desert as the sun moves across it. The reliefs catching the low morning light at angles that make the carved figures seem briefly, almost disconcertingly, alive. The caravanserai walls hold the heat of the afternoon long after the sun has dropped below the flat horizon. At night, in a landscape with no artificial light for many miles in any direction, the stars above Sarab-e Bahram are extraordinary. The same stars that Bahram II saw, from this same location 17 centuries ago. Watching him hunt, watching him receive his ring of divine authority, watching him perform, in the middle of an empty desert, the rituals that connected his kingship to something larger than any empire. What did those rituals accomplish in the theological framework of the people who performed them? And what does it mean that the king chose to engrave the record of those accomplishments here, in stone, in the desert, in a place where only the landscape itself would serve as permanent witness? Sarab-e Bahram left us with the image of a king writing his authority into the desert itself, carving the evidence of divine mandate into stone so remote that only the landscape and the stars would serve as witnesses. It is a gesture that assumes permanence. The assumption that what is carved into rock will outlast the political circumstances that made the carving necessary. That the stone will remember even when the civilization that shaped it has dissolved into the general sediment of history. But sometimes the stone is not enough. Sometimes an entire city is carved into a landscape so effectively that the landscape itself becomes the concealment, and what was built to last becomes instead something that simply disappears. In the Sierra Madre Occidental mountain range of the Mexican state of Sinaloa, where the terrain rises sharply from the Pacific coastal plain into a labyrinth of deep canyons, highland plateaus, and forest so dense that aerial survey struggles to penetrate it, there is a site that the broader world has barely begun to register. Its name is Saru Maru, and it is, in the most straightforward sense, a city that was hidden so successfully that it remained effectively unknown to outside researchers until very recently, and whose full extent, whose origins, and whose relationship to the cultures around it remain, in almost every essential detail, unresolved. The Sierra Madre Occidental is not a gentle landscape. It is one of the most physically challenging environments in North America, a region of extreme elevation changes, seasonal flooding, limited access, and an ecological complexity that makes systematic survey enormously difficult. The indigenous communities who have lived in these mountains for centuries, the Yoram, the Raramuri, the various groups collectively and often imprecisely labeled as the Cajita peoples, developed cultures precisely adapted to this terrain, and their knowledge of the landscape's features is orders of magnitude more detailed than anything the archaeological record has yet managed to formally capture. Saru Maru was known to local communities long before it entered any academic or governmental record. What outside researchers began to document in the early stages of what remains a very preliminary investigation are the remains of a settlement of considerable scale. Terraced platforms cut into the steep highland terrain in patterns that echo the agricultural and architectural traditions found elsewhere in the broader region, but with specific features that do not map cleanly onto any single known cultural tradition. Stone structures of varying size and apparent function are distributed across a landscape that makes their construction a significant engineering achievement in its own right. The terrain here does not offer flat surfaces or easy access to building materials in the organized way that lowland sites provide. Everything about construction in the Sierra Madre Occidental requires adaptation, improvisation, and a knowledge of the local landscape so intimate that it could only have been developed over many generations of sustained habitation. The people who built at Saru Maru knew this land deeply. The cultural context in which Saru Maru sits is itself incompletely understood. The broader region of Sinaloa and the adjacent areas of Sonora, Chihuahua, and Durango represent a transitional zone between the Mesoamerican civilizations to the south and east, the cultures of central Mexico, whose complexity and duration are relatively well documented, and the cultures of the American Southwest to the north, whose connections to Mesoamerica have been debated for more than a century. This transitional zone is sometimes called Oasis America, or the Greater Southwest in academic literature, and it is a region whose archaeology has historically received less sustained attention than either Mesoamerica or the Southwest independently. The cultures of the Sierra Madre Occidental in particular, the highland communities whose settlements dot the canyon walls and plateau edges throughout this mountain system, remain among the least studied of any prehistoric population in North America north of Mexico City. Saru Maru sits within this understudied landscape, which means that the basic comparative framework needed to interpret what is found here, to say with confidence, this feature is typical, this feature is anomalous, this material culture belongs to this tradition, is itself still being constructed. What researchers have been able to establish in the preliminary work that has been conducted is that the site shows evidence of occupation extending across a considerable time span. The surface material culture, pottery fragments, lithic debris, architectural remains, suggests a settlement history that likely encompasses several centuries at minimum, though the precise dating awaits the systematic excavation that has not yet been carried out. The architectural terracing, in particular, raises questions about the organizational capacity of whoever built here. Cutting level platforms from steep highland terrain, managing the drainage implications of that modification, constructing stone structures that could endure the seasonal extremes of a mountain environment. These are not the activities of a small, temporary, or organizationally simple community. They imply sustained collective labor, maintained over time, in service of a settlement whose permanence was clearly intended. Someone built Saru Maru to last. The question of who, precisely, and in what cultural tradition, connects to one of the most actively debated questions in North American archaeology: the nature and extent of connections between the cultures of the Sierra Madre Occidental and the better-known civilizations to their south. Paquimé, the remarkable prehistoric city in the Casas Grandes region of Chihuahua, whose multi-storied adobe architecture, sophisticated water management, and extensive trade connections made it one of the most significant archaeological sites in northern Mexico, sits in a broadly related cultural zone. Some researchers have proposed that the highland communities of the Sierra Madre, including sites in the Sinaloa region, were part of a network of interaction that included Paquimé and extended southward toward the major Mesoamerican centers. The evidence for this connectivity is partial and contested. Certain artifact types found in the Sierra Madre highlands show affinities with materials from both the Casas Grandes tradition and Mesoamerican cultures further south. Trade goods, copper bells, macaw feathers, shell ornaments that are known to have moved along specific routes connecting the Pacific coast, the highland interior, and the Gulf Coast regions appear at sites throughout this area. Did Saru Maru participate in these exchange networks? And if so, at what level, as a peripheral community receiving occasional trade goods from distant centers, or as a node of some significance in a network whose full geographic extent we have not yet mapped? The site's location in the Sierra Madre Highlands, if it was occupied over a long period, would have positioned it at the intersection of multiple micro-environments, the highland forests, the canyon systems that descend toward the coast, the plateau grasslands above, whose combined ecological resources would have supported a mixed economy of agriculture, hunting, and the exploitation of resources that lowland communities could not directly access. Highland communities in many parts of the world have leveraged precisely this kind of ecological positioning to establish themselves as essential intermediaries in exchange networks, providing resources available only at altitude to lowland partners who provided in return the agricultural surpluses and manufactured goods that highland terrain does not easily support. Was Saru Maru such an intermediary? Fringe researchers, working from the limited available documentation and drawing on broader speculative traditions about pre-Columbian North American civilizations, have proposed that the Sierra Madre Highland sites, including Saru Maru, represent evidence of a cultural complexity in northwestern Mexico that mainstream archaeology has systematically underestimated. Some have suggested connections to the legendary Aztec homeland of Aztlan, which Nahuatl oral tradition places somewhere to the northwest of central Mexico, and which has been speculatively identified with various locations across the northern Mexican landscape for more than a century. The Aztlan identification is not supported by archaeological evidence in any direct way, and the site-specific proposal that Saru Maru might represent or connect to this legendary origin place exceeds what current knowledge of the site permits. But the underlying observation that the cultural landscape of the Sierra Madre Occidental in Sinaloa and adjacent regions remains inadequately studied, and that significant sites may exist here whose importance has not yet been recognized, is not a fringe observation. It is a straightforward acknowledgement of where the gaps in North American archaeological knowledge actually lie. Saru Maru is, in the most honest terms, a site about which we know very little. The preliminary work that has been done suggests a settlement of meaningful scale and duration, embedded in a cultural landscape whose connections and complexity are themselves only partially understood. The systematic excavation, the dating programs, the material culture analysis that would begin to answer the basic questions, when, who, how long, connected to what, have not been conducted. The forest holds the site gently. The highland climate that has preserved what remains above the surface, the terraces, the structural outlines, the accumulated debris of occupation, has also kept it inaccessible to the kind of sustained research attention that comparably significant sites in more approachable landscapes have received. And perhaps that inaccessibility is, in a strange way, a form of protection, because what has not been excavated has not been disturbed. What has not been formally documented has not been looted, or at least not as systematically as sites whose significance became known before their protection could be established. Saru Maru waits in its highland forest, terraced into a landscape that has hidden it effectively for centuries, holding whatever it knows about the people who built it, the networks they participated in, the duration of their occupation, and the reasons, if reasons there were, why they eventually left. Or did they leave? Are the descendants of Saru Maru's builders among the communities still living in the canyons and highlands of the Sierra Madre today, carrying in their oral traditions, in their knowledge of the landscape, in the cultural memory that survives when stone and pottery do not? the story of what was built here and why. And if so, is the city truly lost? Or is it simply waiting for the question to be asked of the right people, in the right language, with the right kind of patience? Saru Maru reminded us that some of history's most significant places are not lost because they were destroyed or buried, or deliberately hidden. They are lost because no one looked, because the landscape that contains them is difficult enough, remote enough, understudied enough, that the questions that would unlock them have simply not yet been asked with sufficient patience and sufficient resource. But there is another category of mystery entirely. Places where the questions have been asked, where researchers have looked, carefully and repeatedly, across many decades, where the physical evidence is not absent but abundant, almost overwhelming in its accumulation, and where, despite all of that looking, the central question remains as open as it was the day the first investigator arrived. In the highlands of central Georgia, the country of the southern Caucasus, where the mountains fold into each other in configurations of extraordinary complexity, and the valleys between them have sheltered human communities since the earliest chapters of the species, there is a lake whose name, translated literally, means something that most visitors are not prepared for: Skull Lake. Bashplemi sits at an elevation of approximately 2,000 meters in the Trialeti mountain range, a highland zone of considerable beauty and considerable remoteness. The lake itself is not large, a few hundred meters across, fed by mountain springs and snowmelt, its surface reflecting the surrounding peaks with the particular clarity of high-altitude water, in a landscape where the air holds almost no dust. In summer, the surrounding meadows fill with wildflowers. The silence here is the kind that has texture, not the absence of sound but the presence of a quiet so complete that it registers as a physical sensation. It is, by any conventional measure, a beautiful and peaceful place. And then you look beneath the surface. Visible through the clear water, rising from the lake floor, extending across a substantial portion of the bottom, distributed in a pattern that is immediately recognizable as not natural, are human bones. Thousands of them. Skulls in particular. Arranged, and the word arrangement is not metaphorical here, it is genuinely descriptive, in concentrations that suggest deliberate placement rather than accidental accumulation. Long bones, vertebrae, the compressed, mineral-stained remains of what researchers who have studied the site estimate to be hundreds, possibly thousands, of individual human beings, all of them in the water, all of them apparently placed there. The discovery of Bashplemi's underwater bone deposits was not recent. Local communities have known about them for generations, and the lake's name reflects that knowledge, passed down through the oral traditions of the people who have lived in this highland region across centuries. The bones were noted by outside researchers in the Soviet period, when Georgian archaeology was actively documented as part of broader Caucasian ethnographic programs. What those researchers found, and what subsequent investigation has confirmed, is a deposit of human skeletal material of a scale and a character that defies easy explanation within any single interpretive framework. The mainstream archaeological consensus, to the extent that one exists for a site this poorly understood, frames the bone deposits of Bashplemi as the result of a long-term mortuary practice. The use of the lake as a site of secondary burial or bone deposition, possibly over an extended period spanning several centuries. The Trialeti region has a rich and complex archaeological record of Bronze Age and later cultures whose mortuary practices were sophisticated and varied. The famous Trialeti kurgans, burial mounds containing extraordinary gold and silver objects that rank among the finest prehistoric metalwork in the entire Caucasus, were excavated nearby in the 1930s and revealed a culture of considerable wealth and ritual elaboration. A lake used for the deposition of human remains in this cultural context is not impossible to situate. Water burial and lake deposition are attested in various forms across the ancient world, from the bog bodies of northern Europe to the cenote sacrifices of the Maya. Sacred lakes, in many ancient religious traditions, served as thresholds, passages between the living world and whatever lay beyond it. And the deposition of human remains in such places could serve a range of ritual purposes, whose specific meanings varied considerably between cultures. But the Bashplemi deposits are difficult to reconcile with any single, coherent mortuary program of the kind this explanation implies. The sheer quantity of material suggests an accumulation far exceeding what a normal community death rate would produce, even over many generations. The distribution pattern of the bones across the lake floor does not obviously correspond to what deliberate, organized deposition by a continuous community would be expected to produce. And the absence, so far as current investigation has been able to establish, of the grave goods that typically accompany formal burial in the Bronze Age cultures of this region raises questions about whether this was truly mortuary practice in the conventional sense. Were these people buried here or deposited here? And is there a difference in this context that matters? The question of violence is one that researchers approach carefully and that the available evidence does not resolve clearly. Some of the skeletal material shows evidence of perimortem trauma, injuries to the bone occurring at or around the time of death. But the degree of preservation and the challenges of underwater examination make precise forensic analysis difficult, and the trauma evidence that has been documented could be consistent with multiple causes: warfare, sacrifice, epidemic disease followed by mass disposal, or the physical damage that bodies sustain when they enter water and sink. The lake's depth and the condition of the bones have complicated the systematic study that a site of this significance would ordinarily receive. Underwater archaeology is resource-intensive and technically demanding under any conditions. At altitude, in a remote highland lake with limited access infrastructure, those challenges are compounded considerably. What has been studied carefully. What has not been studied, the full extent of the deposit, the total number of individuals represented, the chronological range of the accumulation, the demographic profile of the dead, remains unknown. And in those unknowns, interpretation proliferates. Local oral traditions in the Trialeti region carry accounts of the lake that researchers have documented but not been able to fully integrate with the archaeological evidence. Some traditions describe Bashplemi as a site of mass death following a historical catastrophe, a battle, an epidemic, a disaster of sufficient scale to produce the bones that fill the lake. Other traditions frame the lake in explicitly sacred terms, a place of offering, of communication with forces beyond ordinary reach, of a ritual practice whose specific content has been lost, but whose importance was understood to be fundamental. These traditions are not evidence in the strict archaeological sense. They are memory, the particular kind of long-duration cultural memory that highland communities develop about the significant features of their landscape, passed through generations in forms that compress and distort specific details, while often preserving, with surprising fidelity, the emotional and categorical reality of what happened. Something significant happened at Bashplemi. The bones confirm that. What exactly it was, the bones do not say. Fringe researchers have been drawn to Bashplemi with a predictable intensity. A lake full of skulls in a remote mountain landscape is precisely the kind of site that generates speculative narratives of considerable ambition. Some have proposed connections to ancient sacrificial traditions of a scale and organization that the known cultures of the Trialeti region could not have sustained, implying an unknown or unrecognized civilization of greater complexity as the agent of whatever produced the deposit. Others have connected the lake to broader theories about the Caucasus as a zone of ancient catastrophe, a region where the intersection of major population movements, climate events, and cultural conflicts produced episodes of mass death that have been only partially absorbed into the historical record. These proposals are not supported by the current evidence in any direct way. But the frustrating truth is that the current evidence is genuinely insufficient to confidently support the mainstream interpretation either. Bashplemi is a site that needs more science than it has received. It needs systematic underwater survey, comprehensive skeletal documentation, radiocarbon dating of a sufficient sample to establish the chronological range of the deposit, isotopic analysis to determine the geographic origins of the individuals represented, and the kind of detailed forensic examination that can distinguish between the various possible causes of the trauma that has been observed. None of this has been done at the scale the site requires. And until it is, Bashplemi will continue to sit in its highland meadow, its surface placid, and its depths populated with the unidentified dead, generating questions that its current state of investigation cannot resolve. The water is cold here, even in summer, clear to a depth that lets the light reach the bones on the lake floor, illuminating them briefly, in the right conditions, with a quality of visibility that is almost unbearable. They are right there, within reach almost of a hand extended from the surface. Thousands of people, placed here or fallen here across some span of time that we have not yet determined, for reasons that we have not yet established, by agents whose identity we have not yet confirmed. The mountain wind moves across the surface of the lake and raises small ripples that distort the view of what lies beneath, as if the water itself is not quite ready to give up its account. Who are the dead of Bashplemi? And what happened in this highland lake at some point in the human past that required so many of them to be here?